The first thing Alex noticed about Blackwood Hollow was the silence. It was a heavy, suffocating quiet that seemed to swallow the very sound of his footsteps on the cobblestone path. He had arrived at the cusp of dusk, the sky bleeding from a bruised purple to a deep, starless black. The air was unnaturally cold for the season, carrying a damp chill that seeped through his coat and settled deep in his bones. A single guttering lantern hung above the door of a squat stone building ahead, its flickering light the only sign of life in the encroaching gloom. As he walked further into the village, a rhythmic, percussive sound began, pulling his attention to the rows of cottages that lined the narrow lane. One by one, their wooden shutters slammed shut. The sound was not random or casual. It was a deliberate, synchronized closing, a wave of rejection that moved just behind him, as if the village itself was sealing its eyes against his presence, or against something that walked in his shadow. He glanced over his shoulder, but the lane behind him was empty, swallowed by the thick twilight. Yet the feeling of being followed was a tangible pressure between his shoulder blades, a cold spot in the air that moved with him. He quickened his pace, his heart thudding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The only establishment that showed any light was the inn, a two-story building with a sign that creaked ominously in the windless air, depicting a faded black bird on a gnarled branch. He pushed the heavy door open, the warmth from the hearth inside a stark contrast to the deathly chill of the street. The common room was nearly empty, save for a man behind a rough-hewn bar who was polishing a tankard with a frantic, nervous energy. The innkeeper's head snapped up as Alex entered, his eyes wide and darting toward the shuttered windows. Without a word, the man took Alex's coin for a room, his fingers trembling. He pressed the key into Alex's palm, leaning close. His breath smelled of stale ale and fear. He warned Alex to stay inside, to lock his door, and under no circumstances to answer any sound he might hear from the corridor after dark. The man's gaze was desperate, pleading, before he retreated back behind the relative safety of his bar. The room he was given was small and Spartan, smelling of dust and old wood. Alex bolted the door and leaned against it, listening. For a long moment, there was only the pounding of his own blood in his ears. Then they began. Faint at first, like the rustle of dry leaves, the whispers started. They were just on the other side of the door, a sibilant, multi-voiced murmur that held no words he could understand, only a tone of cold, predatory interest. The floorboards in the hallway creaked under a slow, deliberate weight. Step, pause, step. The sound stopped directly outside his room. The whispering grew more intense, pressing against the door like a physical force. Alex held his breath, his hand frozen on the cold bolt. His entire world narrowed to the terrifying space on the other side of the wood. Dawn brought no comfort, only a pale, watery light that did little to dispel the deep-seated chill clinging to the village. The whispers had faded with the night, but their memory was a fresh scar on Alex's mind. Sleep had been impossible. Every creak of the old inn had been a footstep, every rustle of the wind a returning whisper. The innkeeper, when Alex descended, would not meet his eyes, merely gesturing with a curt nod toward a bowl of thin porridge before busying himself with a task in the back. The man's silence was more telling than any warning. It was the quiet of a prisoner who had long ago accepted his cell. Driven by a need for answers that outweighed his lingering fear, Alex ventured back into the hollow. The cottages remained shuttered, their blank, wooden faces offering no welcome. His destination was the small stone building that served as the village's record hall, a place the innkeeper had mentioned in a hushed, offhand comment the previous evening. The door was unlocked, as if no one in Blackwood Hollow feared common thieves, only the things that walked in the dark. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of old paper and dust motes dancing in the slivers of light cutting through a grimy window. Ledgers and parchments were piled haphazardly on rough shelves, a chaotic archive of a community that wanted to forget its own history. For hours, Alex sifted through the brittle pages. He found census records with names scratched out, accounts of harvests that failed for no reason, and then tucked within a folio of council minutes he found it. The entries were sparse, written in a hurried, fearful script. They spoke of a walker in the dusk, a formless entity of shadow and cold that preyed upon travelers who lingered after sunset. It was not a ghost of a person, but something older, a malignancy born from the deep woods that cradled the village. The records described its method: a silent pursuit, a draining chill, and victims found at dawn, unharmed but utterly terrifyingly vacant, their minds scoured clean. The final chilling note was a single line of advice, a desperate piece of folklore scrawled in a margin. It has no face of its own and fears only to see one. The words echoed in his mind as he hurried back to the inn, the day already beginning its swift surrender to evening. The slamming shutters he had witnessed were not an act of hostility, but one of desperate protection. The villagers were not hiding from him, they were hiding from what followed him. As twilight began to bleed the color from the world, he took the small, tarnished hand mirror from the washstand in his room. Its surface was speckled and dark, but it would have to do. He did not wait for the whispers this time. He stood in the center of his room, the mirror held tight in his sweating hand, and faced the door. The cold came first, seeping under the doorframe, frosting the air in his lungs. Then the footsteps, slow and certain, followed by the soft, insistent press of the whispers. The door handle rattled, not with force, but with a patient, probing twist. Alex's heart hammered against his ribs, a wild drumbeat of primal fear. He raised the mirror, angling it toward the door. The entity manifested not as a shape, but as an absence, a patch of deeper darkness that bled into the room, swallowing the faint light from the window. It was a void of shifting, oily shadows, and at its core was a cold so profound it felt like a physical wound. It flowed toward him, and Alex, his arm trembling, thrust the mirror forward. The thing hesitated. In the speckled glass, its own form was reflected, a roiling, featureless nothingness. For a terrifying second, the shadows seemed to coalesce, to try and form a shape in the reflection, and in that attempt, they recoiled. A silent, psychic shriek of denial vibrated through the room. The darkness convulsed, fraying at the edges like smoke in a gale, and then it was gone. The oppressive cold vanished with it, leaving only the mundane chill of the night air. Alex stood there for a long time, his breath coming in ragged gasps, the mirror now feeling impossibly heavy in his hand. The truth settled upon him with the weight of a tombstone. The slamming shutters were a ritual, a way for the villagers to make themselves invisible, to force the wandering entity to focus solely on the outsider, the one who did not know the rules. He had been the bait, and he had only survived by accident and a fragment of forgotten wisdom. He left at first light, not looking back as he walked the road out of Blackwood Hollow. The village, now bathed in the weak morning sun, looked as quiet and harmless as any other, but Alex knew its secret. He carried the memory of the formless thing in the mirror, and the unsettling knowledge that some places survive not by fighting their monsters, but by feeding them. The bell began to toll just as the fog rolled in, a deep, sonorous clang that seemed to physically push against the thick, gray mist swallowing the moors. For Dr. Alastair Evans, the sound was the first true welcome to Briarfield-on-Moor, though the reaction of the villagers suggested it was anything but. He had driven into the village just moments before, the sky a clear, pale blue, but the fog had come with an unnatural speed, pouring over the high stone walls like a silent, spectral tide, muffling the world in damp wool. And then the bell had started, a single, resonant note struck with a slow, funereal rhythm that vibrated through the very stones of the cottages. He pulled his car to a stop outside the small post office, the engine's silence making the bells peal all the more dominant. He watched as a woman hanging washing in a nearby garden froze, her hands clutching a wet sheet, her face turned not toward the sound, but away from it, her expression a mask of deep-seated dread. She hurriedly gathered her basket and retreated inside, shutting her door with a firm, final click. All along the single, winding street, other villagers were doing the same, vanishing into their homes or turning their backs, their movements hurried and furtive. The bell was ringing from the small stone church that stood on a slight rise at the village's edge, its spire a dark finger pointing into the oppressive gray sky. Yet as Evans looked more closely, he could see the bell tower was sealed, its arched openings bricked up with dark, newer stone. There was no way for a bell ringer to be at his work, no way for the sound to be escaping into the heavy air. Intrigued, Evans collected his bag from the passenger seat and made his way to the village's sole lodging, a pub called the Shepherd's Rest. The publican, a large, taciturn man named Mr. Cropper, provided a key to a room with a view of the church with a grim reluctance. When Evans commented on the bell, Cropper's face tightened. He offered no explanation, only a muttered warning that some histories were better left buried, and that the churchyard was no place for a stranger after the fog descended. The man's unease was a palpable force in the low-beamed room, a stark contrast to the academic curiosity burning within Evans. Leaving his bag, Evans decided to begin his work immediately. The village archive was housed in a cramped room at the back of the post office, a space that smelled of mildew, aging parchment, and secrets. The postmistress, a frail woman with nervous eyes, handed him the key with a trembling hand, her gaze flicking constantly toward the window and the relentless, impossible tolling from the sealed tower. For hours, Evans worked by the light of a single, dusty bulb, the bell a constant, grim metronome to his research. He sifted through parish records, faded ledgers, and bundles of letters tied with crumbling ribbon. The official history of Briarfield was one of sheep farming and quiet hardship. Unofficial one, the one whispered in the margins and recorded in the shaky handwriting of frightened vicars, was far darker. He found it in a water-stained journal from the late 18th century. The entries told of a zealous, God-fearing bellringer named Josiah Proudfoot, a man known for his strength and his devotion to his duty. The final entry was brief and chilling. During a terrible storm, a lightning strike had shattered the church's spire. Josiah, believing it a sign of divine wrath, had climbed the damaged tower to ring the bell in a frantic plea for mercy. He was found the next morning at the base of the tower, his body broken, his face frozen in a rictus of terror. The journal's author, the local vicar, had written that Josiah's neck was not broken by the fall, but crushed as if by a massive, invisible hand. The bell had been silent ever since, its tower sealed by a terrified congregation, a tomb for the instrument, and a prison for the spirit of the man who had loved it. Final scrawled line of the entry hinted at a curse, a belief that Josiah's unquiet soul was bound to the bell, his eternal penance for a sin no one could name. His warning clang a perpetual echo of his own terrible end. As the fog pressed against the archive's single window, the bell's mournful peal seemed to grow louder, a direct, haunting confirmation of the tragedy Evans now held in his hands. The truth settled upon Dr. Evans with the grim finality of a tombstone sealing shut. He sat in the dusty archive, the brittle journal pages feeling like skin peeled from a long-dead secret. Josiah Proudfoot had not simply fallen. He had been struck down, his devotion twisted into a chain that bound him to the physical object of his duty. The sealed tower was not just a precaution, it was a desperate act of spiritual imprisonment. The villagers of Briarfield had not silenced the bell to forget their tragedy, but to contain it, and now, for reasons known only to the restless dead. Containment was failing. The bell was not merely ringing, it was screaming, a metallic, mournful shriek across the moors, a warning from a soul denied its rest. Evans knew then that academic curiosity was no longer enough. The ritual required action, a confrontation not with documents, but with the echo of a man's final, terrified moment. He gathered his notes, his movements deliberate, the scholar transforming into an exorcist of forgotten sorrows. The fog outside had grown thicker, a swirling, sightless entity that muffled the world and turned the village into a series of vague gray shapes. The bell's peal was the only thing that cut through it, a sound that seemed to originate not from the church, but from the center of his own skull. He found the churchyard gate unlocked, swinging on rusted hinges as if expecting him. The gravestones within were like a fleet of stone ships adrift in the sea of fog, their inscriptions blurred by moisture and time. The church itself was a darker mass in the gloom, its sealed bell tower a brooding, silent promise of the turmoil within. The heavy oak door groaned open at his touch, revealing an interior choked with shadows and the scent of cold stone and decay. Dust motes, disturbed by his entrance, danced in the sliver of gray light from the door before being swallowed by the oppressive dark. The bell's toll was louder here, a physical vibration that thrummed through the flagstones and up through the soles of his shoes, a rhythmic, agonized heartbeat at the core of the building. Using a small electric lantern, Evans made his way to the base of the tower, to the wall of newer, darker brick that sealed the staircase. Here, the air was several degrees colder, a pocket of profound chill that raised goosebumps on his arms. He could feel it now, not just hear it, the raw, desperate energy of a trapped spirit, its panic and devotion fused into a single, endless moment of ringing the bell. He unpacked his bag with steady hands, laying out the items he had read about in the more esoteric corners of the parish records: a sprig of dried moorland heather, a small, smooth stone from the churchyard, and a vial of water from the village's ancient, unconsecrated well. These were not tools of the church, but of the older, earthbound beliefs that had existed long before the stone church was built. He began the simple ritual, a quiet recitation of names and acknowledgments, not of scripture, but of the man. He spoke Josiah Proudfoot's name into the cold air, acknowledging his duty, his faith, and the terrible injustice of his death. He placed the heather and the stone at the base of the sealed arch, symbols of the land he had loved and the permanence he had been denied. Finally, he sprinkled the well water onto the cold stone floor, a libation for a thirsty soul. He did not command or banish, he appeased. He offered recognition to a story that had been bricked up and forgotten. For a long moment, nothing changed. The bell continued its grim toll. The fog pressed against the stained glass windows, and the cold clung to the stones. Then a subtle shift occurred. The vibration in the floor softened. The next peal of the bell was different, not a sharp, frantic clang of warning, but a deeper, slower, more resonant note that seemed to carry a profound and weary sadness. It rang once more, a final, fading echo that hung in the air like a sigh, and then silence. The absence of sound was more shocking than the noise had been. It was a deep, absolute quiet that felt like a physical release. Evans stood in the sudden stillness, his own breath loud in his ears. He watched as the thick, oppressive fog outside the windows began to thin, to tear apart like rotting cloth. Patches of the late afternoon sky appeared, a clean, pale blue, and the weak, golden light of the setting sun slanted through the dusty air, illuminating the motes of dust that now settled peacefully to the floor. He walked out of the church. Transformed world. The village of Briarfield-on-Moor was emerging from its gray shroud, the stone cottages glowing warmly in the sunset. He saw a door open down the lane, a face peering out, not with fear, but with a tentative, bewildered hope. Evans did not stay to receive their gratitude or their questions. He walked back to the Shepherd's Rest, the weight of the forgotten history now a part of him. He had come to study the past, but he had been forced to intervene in it, to lay a ghost to rest not with force, but with the simple, powerful act of remembrance. The moors stretched out before him, vast and ancient, and he knew that for every village on the map, there were a dozen such stories bricked up in silence, waiting for someone to listen to the echoes. The scarecrows were the first thing Sarah noticed about East Wenton. They stood in silent, ragged regiments across the rolling fields on either side of the narrow lane, their slumped postures and floppy hats giving them an air of weary guardianship. She had entered the village as the afternoon sun began its long, golden slide toward the horizon, casting deep, stretching shadows that seemed to bleed from the feet of the wooden figures. It was a picturesque scene, the kind of rustic charm she had sought on her long-distance hike, but something about the stillness of the scarecrows felt off, a little too perfect, a little too watchful. She walked on, her boots crunching on the gravel, the sound loud in the pastoral quiet. Her eyes, trained by miles of observing the subtle shifts of the landscape, caught a flicker of movement in her peripheral vision. She turned her head toward a scarecrow in a field of young wheat, its arms outstretched in a tattered coat. For a moment she saw nothing but the same still figure. Then, with a slow, almost imperceptible creak of wood and straw, its head tilted a fraction of an inch, its blank, burlap face now angled directly at her. Sarah blinked, shaking her head. A trick of the light, she told herself, the shifting angle of the sun playing games with her tired mind. She dismissed it as a hiker's paranoia, the product of too many hours alone with her thoughts, but the feeling of being watched only intensified, a prickling sensation on the back of her neck that had nothing to do with the warm sun. She quickened her pace, forcing herself not to look at the fields, to focus on the cluster of stone cottages that marked the village center ahead. Yet her resolve broke and she glanced to her left. Another scarecrow, this one in a fallow field, had shifted. Its straw-stuffed legs were no longer parallel. One was slightly forward, as if it had taken a step. A cold knot tightened in her stomach. This was no trick of the light. She scanned the field systematically now, her heart beginning to hammer a frantic rhythm against her ribs. To her right, a scarecrow that had been facing the lane was now turned completely, its back to her, its head cocked as if listening. To her left, another had moved several feet closer to the road, its posture less slumped, more alert. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through her. She broke into a run, her backpack jostling heavily with each stride. The scarecrows were moving, not with the jerky animation of a puppet, but with a slow, deliberate, organic grace that was far more terrifying. They were shifting their positions, a silent, coordinated maneuver executed with the patience of the land itself. As she ran, she saw them in her peripheral vision, a slow-motion tide of ragged cloth and straw, their blank faces all turning, all focusing on her. They weren't just watching, they were encircling her, their movements herding her away from the village center and toward a more isolated part of the valley. Ahead, she spotted a dilapidated wooden barn, its paint peeled away by years of weather, one door hanging open on a broken hinge like a gaping mouth. It was the only shelter in sight. She didn't hesitate, veering off the lane and sprinting across the rough, tufted grass, her breath coming in ragged, sobbing gasps. She threw herself through the open doorway, stumbling into the dim, dusty interior, the smell of old hay and rot filling her nostrils. She scrambled behind a stack of moldering hay bales, her chest heaving, and peered through a gap in the wall's slats. The sun had dipped below the hills, and the long, blue shadows of twilight were deepening into the velvet dark of night. Full moon rose, casting a cold, silver light over the landscape, and in that spectral glow she saw them. The scarecrows were advancing, dozens of them emerging from the fields, their movements silent and relentless. They formed a loose, tightening circle around the barn, their burlap faces pale in the moonlight, their empty eyes fixed on her hiding place. They did not rush, there was no need. They moved with the inexorable certainty of the rising tide, a silent army of the fields closing in on its prey. Sarah hugged her, knees to her chest, the cold of the packed earth seeping through her clothes, a prisoner in a crumbling barn, waiting for the straw-stuffed sentinels to reach her door. Crouched in the dusty gloom of the barn, Sarah watched the silent, advancing figures with a terror that threatened to steal the very air from her lungs. They moved with a slow, rustling grace, their straw-filled limbs whispering against the night air, their blank faces turned toward her refuge like pale, emotionless moons. There was no malice in their advance, no predatory haste, only a patient, inexorable purpose that was somehow more chilling than any overt threat. They were not monsters, they were guardians, and she had trespassed. The realization dawned on her not as a thought, but as a deep, instinctual knowing that settled in her bones. These were not mere effigies animated by some random curse. They were vessels filled with an older, more profound energy, the spirits of the land itself, the echoes of those who had worked this soil, loved it, and never truly left it. As the circle of scarecrows tightened, their movements became less about pursuit and more about positioning, a ritualistic encirclement. They stopped just beyond the threshold of the barn's moonlight, a ring of silent sentinels standing watch. They were not coming in, they were ensuring she did not leave. The immediate clawing panic began to recede, replaced by a cold, clear clarity. She was not going to be attacked, she was being held, judged. And judgment required understanding. Pushing herself up on trembling legs, Sarah turned her back on the watchers and faced the interior of the barn. The moonlight sliced through gaps in the walls, illuminating floating motes of dust and the skeletal shapes of forgotten farm tools. She had to know why. Her eyes scanned the shadows, falling upon an old rotting tack box tucked beneath a collapsed beam. Something glinted within it, a faint metallic wink in the silvery light. Her heart thudded with a new, different kind of urgency. She knelt, her fingers brushing aside cobwebs and the brittle carcasses of dead insects, and closed her hand around a small, tarnished silver locket. It was cold against her palm, intricately engraved with a pattern of intertwined wheat stalks, now worn almost smooth by time. With fumbling fingers, she pried it open. Inside, protected by the tarnished silver, was a tiny, sepia-toned photograph of a young woman with gentle eyes and a soft smile, her hair piled high in a style from a century past. Opposite the portrait was a single, fine lock of pale hair, tied with a faded silk thread. The locket was not just an object, it was a story, a tangible piece of a love that had outlasted flesh and bone. The air in the barn seemed to stir, not with a wind, but with a sudden, profound sense of longing, a sorrow so deep and old it felt like the land itself was sighing. The name came to her not as a sound, but as an impression, an image of a weathered headstone she had glimpsed on a hillock at the edge of the fields as she entered the valley. Eleanor, the lost love of a farmer named Samuel Croft, according to the brief inscription. He had buried her there so she could always watch over the land he tended, and he had never taken another. The story was a local legend, a piece of folklore she had read in a hiking guide, but now it was real, a truth held in her hand. The scarecrows were not just spirits of farmers, they were Samuel's spirit and the spirits of those like him, bound to the land by a loyalty that transcended death. They were protecting Eleanor's final resting place, and she, a stranger, had strayed too close. Holding the locket tight, Sarah turned and walked to the barn door. The ring of scarecrows stood motionless, but their attention was a palpable force. She took a step forward, then another, moving through the open doorway and into the circle of their silent vigil. They did not move to stop her. She walked past them, their burlap faces turning to track her progress, a silent, ragged honor guard. She walked through the moonlit fields, the dew-soaked grass soaking her trousers, her path leading unerringly toward the small, lonely hillock with its single, weathered stone. The grave was simple, the name Eleanor still faintly visible beneath a blanket of moss and ivy. Sarah knelt, the cool damp of the earth seeping through her knees. She placed the locket gently at the base of the headstone, nestling it amongst the ivy roots. As her fingers left the cold metal, a profound stillness fell over the valley. The constant, rustling presence that had filled the air since dusk simply vanished. She looked back toward the barn, toward the fields. The scarecrows were gone, not vanished, but returned. They stood once more in their original slumped positions across the fields, simple, inanimate figures of straw and wood, their backs to her, facing the crops they were meant to protect. The spell was broken. Guardians had been appeased, the lost treasure had been returned, and in its return, a century of sorrow found a moment of peace. Sarah stood and walked away from East Wenton, the first hints of dawn staining the eastern sky with pale gold and rose. She did not look back. The lesson of the valley settled deep within her, a quiet understanding of the power of loyalty and the enduring ache of loss. Some loves were so fierce they could stitch a soul to the land itself, and some goodbyes were never truly said, only waited upon with infinite patience, under the sun and the moon in the silent watch of the fields. The abandoned cottages of Lannermere did not wait for the moon to glow. As the last sliver of sun vanished behind the jagged peaks, the windows of the derelict homes began to kindle with a soft, phosphorescent light, a cold, internal luminescence that had no source and cast no warmth. For Ben, standing at the edge of the overgrown village green with his tripod already set, the sight was both breathtaking and unnerving. It was the very phenomenon he had traveled so far to capture, a photographer's dream and a rational man's nightmare. The light was a pale, sickly greenish-white, the color of old bone or deep-sea creatures, and it pulsed with a slow, rhythmic cadence, as if the village itself was breathing in its sleep. He had chosen a spot on a small, grassy knoll that gave him a panoramic view of the main cluster of cottages. Their stone walls were crumbling, their roofs sagging like tired spines, but every gaping window and empty doorway bloomed with this impossible, silent light. He worked quickly, the familiar rituals of his craft a small anchor in the sea of strangeness. The click of the camera's shutter was a sharp, definitive sound in the profound quiet, a tiny rebellion against the eerie glow. Yet with each photograph he took, the feeling of being observed grew from a faint prickle to a heavy, undeniable weight. It was not the simple unease of being alone in a forgotten place. This was a specific, focused attention. He could feel it emanating from the luminous windows, a collective gaze from the empty houses that tracked his every movement, studied the lines of his face, and noted the placement of his equipment. Ignoring the crawling sensation between his shoulder blades, Ben changed lenses, swapping his wide angle for a powerful telephoto. He focused on the nearest cottage, its front door hanging open to reveal a hallway bathed in the same unearthly glow. He zoomed in, the image sharpening in his viewfinder. The light was not uniform. It swirled and eddied like luminous fog, and within its depths he thought he saw shapes, fleeting, half-formed suggestions of human figures standing in the rooms looking out. He snapped the picture, the shutter's sound swallowed by the deep silence of the night. He took another and another, a compulsive need to capture the uncanny truth driving him forward. The air grew colder, the unnatural. Light seeming to leach the warmth from the world, and the feeling of being watched became a pressure, a silent audience holding its breath. Later, hunched over his portable developing kit in the orange glow of his small camp lantern, the true nature of his photographs began to emerge. The chemical bath swirled, and the first image materialized on the paper. It was the shot of the open doorway. The luminous fog was there, just as he had seen it, but now developed and fixed. The shapes within it were no longer suggestions. They were stark and clear. A tall, gaunt figure stood just inside the threshold, its form composed of the same sickly light, its head turned not toward the interior of the house, but directly toward the lens toward him. Its face was a blur of light, featureless, yet the posture of its body was one of intense, unwavering observation. His hands trembled as he pulled the next print from the bath. This was a shot of a first-floor window. In the viewfinder, it had seemed empty save for the glow. On the paper, a cluster of smaller, childlike figures were pressed against the glass, their luminous hands splayed on the pane, their blank, light-filled faces staring out into the night, staring at him. A third photograph revealed a figure halfway through a wall, its lower body dissipating into the stonework, its upper body leaning out, an arm outstretched as if in silent supplication or warning. Ben sat back on his heels, the cold night air no longer just a chill but a deep, penetrating frost that had seeped into his soul. The cottages were not merely glowing. They were inhabited. The figures in his photographs were not tricks of the light or flaws in the film. They were residents, and they had not only been watching him all along, they had been posing for him, making themselves seen through the one medium he understood. The initial thrill of discovery curdled into a sharp, metallic fear. He had not come to Lanternmere to document a simple anomaly of light. He had walked uninvited into a ghostly family album, and every click of his shutter had been a flashbulb illuminating a gallery of the dead. The ghostly figures in the developed photographs stared out, their luminous, featureless faces a silent accusation and a plea. Ben's initial fear, cold and sharp, began to thaw into a profound, aching curiosity. These were not malevolent phantoms. Their postures in the frozen moments spoke of a deep, collective sorrow, a story suspended in time. They had allowed themselves to be seen, had used his camera as a conduit. The least he could do was listen. He spent the remainder of the night not sleeping, but researching. The glow from his laptop screened a stark, modern contrast to the ancient, pulsing light from the cottages. The local digital archives were sparse, but a scanned copy of a crumbling county history, its text blurry and faded, held the key. He found a brief, almost forgotten entry about Lanternmere, a village that had not been abandoned by a slow exodus but had been emptied in a single, terrible season decades ago. It spoke of a wasting fever, a plague that had swept through the remote community with a vicious, inexplicable speed. There were no tales of a malevolent curse or a vengeful spirit, only the stark, simple tragedy of a sickness that left no time for proper burials, no time for last words. The healthy had fled, sealing the dead inside their homes in a desperate attempt to contain the contagion, leaving the village to the ghosts and its new, mournful name. As he read the final words, a soft, chiming sound reached his ears, not through the air, but through the camera that lay on the ground beside him. He picked it up. The sound was emanating from the device itself, a faint, ethereal ringing. He lifted it, pointing the lens toward the nearest glowing cottage. Through the viewfinder, the scene shifted. The swirling luminescence coalesced, the figures within becoming sharper, more defined. He saw a woman. Rocking a bundle of light in her arms, a man slumped over a table, a group of children huddled together in a corner. And then, as if a silent film had begun to play, images began to imprint themselves directly onto his mind, transmitted through the camera's eye. He saw the first cough, the frantic attempts to heal with poultices and prayers, the terror in the eyes of the healthy as they nailed shut their neighbors' doors, the final fading moments of those left inside, not with rage, but with a bewildered sadness as their world contracted to the four walls of their homes. The story was not one of horror, but of heartbreak, a quiet communal extinction. Ben understood then. The lights were not a haunting in the traditional sense. They were an echo, a residual memory of the villagers' final night, playing on an endless loop. They were trapped in the moment of their passing, and his camera, a device designed to capture and preserve moments, had become a key. He spent the hours until dawn. In a silent, profound communion, He would raise the camera, focus on a window or a doorway, and receive another fragment of the story. A shared meal suddenly abandoned, a lullaby cut short, a final loving touch. Each image was a piece of a vast, sorrowful mosaic. He was not a photographer anymore. He was an archaeologist of souls, gently brushing the dust from a lost tragedy. As the first hint of gray touched the eastern sky, the phenomenon began to fade. The pulsing glow within the cottages softened, its rhythm slowing like a dying heartbeat. The figures within the light grew transparent, their forms dissolving back into the memory from which they had briefly emerged. Ben watched, his camera hanging from his neck as one by one, the windows of Lanternmere darkened. The village did not simply go dark, it seemed to sigh, a final, collective exhalation before settling back into the true, profound silence of abandonment. The weight of the night's revelations settled upon him, not as a burden but as a sacred trust. He packed his equipment as the sun crested the hills, its warm, golden light revealing the village in its true state, a collection of crumbling, roofless ruins choked with nettles and ivy. There was no sign of the luminous residents, no trace of the poignant drama that unfolded each night. He loaded his car, the portfolio case on the passenger seat feeling heavier than it ever had. It no longer contained mere photographs, it held elegies. Each print was a headstone for a story that had nearly been erased, a testament to a community that had vanished in a whisper. He drove away from Lanternmere as the morning mists rose from the lowlands. He did not look back. His purpose had been transformed. He had come to capture an eerie spectacle and was leaving as the bearer of a final, fading memory. The ghosts had not asked for vengeance or release. They had only asked to be remembered. And in the stark, beautiful, heartbreaking images now sealed in his portfolio, Ben knew he would honor that request, ensuring the lost villagers of Lanternmere would never truly be gone. The laughter of children is a sound that can carve a canyon through a grieving heart. For Maya, the silence left behind by her son's absence had become a physical presence, a hollowed-out space in the world that echoed with everything that was gone. It was this silence that drove her to Old Marbury, a village recommended by a friend as a place of quiet reflection, a landscape where sorrow could perhaps breathe and soften at the edges. She arrived as the day was bleeding away, the sky a wash of deep violet and bruised orange, the long shadows of evening stitching themselves seamlessly into the fabric of her own gloom. The village was a picture of tranquil decay, a place that seemed to have gracefully accepted its own slide into obsolescence. Stone cottages with sagging rooflines nestled amongst overgrown gardens, and the air was sweet with the scent of honeysuckle and damp earth. She parked her car near the village green, the engine's silence a stark prelude to the sound that would soon unravel her. It started as a faint, distant tremor on the air, a sound so achingly familiar it made her breath catch in her throat. Laughter, the bright, unfettered, bell-like laughter of children at play. Her head snapped up, her eyes scanning the green. It was empty save for a few grazing sheep and the skeletal frame of an old, weathered playground. The swings hung motionless, the slide a tarnished silver tongue in the fading light. The seesaw was still. Yet the laughter continued, a joyous, chaotic chorus that seemed to emanate from the very center of the empty play area. It was not a trick of the wind or a memory conjured by her own desperate mind. It was real, a tangible, auditory ghost that wrapped around her, both a balm and a blade. Drawn by a force deeper than curiosity, a pull as fundamental as a magnet to its pole, Maya walked toward the playground, her footsteps on. The gravel path were muffled, as if the sound itself was being absorbed by the pervasive, echoing mirth. The laughter swirled around her, now close and clear, now distant and faint, a stereophonic phantom. She could almost distinguish individual voices, a high, gleeful shriek from the top of the slide, a boy's deep, rolling chuckle from beneath the climbing frame. She reached the rusting fence that encircled the playground and gripped the cold, flaking metal, her knuckles white. The swings began to move. Not with the wild, random jerks of the wind, but with the smooth, rhythmic arcs of a child being pushed. The empty seat rose and fell, and with each descent a fresh peal of laughter rang out. On the roundabout, a shadow flickered, a patch of deeper twilight that coalesced into the vague, shimmering form of a child, spinning with arms outstretched before dissolving back into the gloom. By the sandpit, another shadow figure knelt, its form insubstantial as smoke, its hands moving in a pantomime of digging. Maya stood transfixed, a storm of conflicting emotions tearing through her. A wild, impossible hope bloomed in her chest, so fierce it was painful. For a breathtaking second, she saw her own son in every fleeting shadow, heard his voice in every ripple of laughter. But as quickly as it came, the hope curdled into a sorrow so profound it felt like her bones were turning to dust. These were not her child. They were echoes, phantoms, a beautiful, cruel mockery of the life that had been stolen from her. The laughter that had initially felt like a gift now felt like a condemnation, a reminder of a joy she could witness but never again hold. Tears streamed down her face, hot and silent, as she watched the ghostly children play in their timeless, empty world. their happiness a mirror that reflected only the depth of her own devastating loss. The phantom laughter, once a source of agonizing hope, now settled around Maya as a profound and gentle truth. The shimmering, shadowy figures on the swings and the roundabout were not a cruel trick of her grief, but a manifestation of something else entirely, a shared sorrow given voice not in weeping, but in the universal language of play. Standing there at the rusted fence, her tears cooling on her cheeks, she felt the sharp edges of her own pain begin to soften, not because the loss was any less, but because she was no longer alone in it. Ghosts were not mocking her. They were inviting her to remember that joy, however fleeting, could persist even in the realm of shadows. She did not know how long she stood there, watching the ethereal ballet, but as the last sliver of sun vanished, a soft light appeared in the window of a nearby cottage. An old woman, her face a roadmap of wrinkles and kindness, stood there holding a cup. She did not look at the playground with fear, but with a quiet, familiar sadness. Compelled, Maya walked toward the cottage. The woman opened the door before she could knock, her eyes holding a deep, understanding sympathy. She ushered Maya inside to a warm, cluttered kitchen smelling of bread and lavender, and without a word being spoken, she poured a second cup of tea. The story the old woman shared was not one of horror, but of heartbreak. Decades ago, a school bus carrying the village children had skidded on a patch of black ice on the road leading out of Old Marbury, tumbling down an embankment into the icy river below. There were no survivors. The village, hollowed out by the tragedy, had never truly recovered. But as the years passed, a strange comfort emerged. At dusk, the laughter would return to the old playground, the spirits of the children drawn back to the place of their happiest memories. They were not trapped or vengeful, they were a gift, a nightly reminder to the bereaved that their loved ones were not lost in darkness, but were forever at play in a sunlit meadow of memory. The parents and grandparents of Old Marbury did not fear the laughter. They listened for it, a bittersweet lullaby that soothed the ragged edges of their grief. The explanation settled over Maya like a warm shawl. The ghosts were not a haunting, they were a healing. They were the village's collective memory, made audible and visible, a testament to love that refused to be entirely silenced by death. The old woman's quiet acceptance was the final piece of the puzzle. Maya had been drawn here not by chance, but by a shared frequency of loss, and the children had recognized a kindred spirit. Finished with her tea, Maya thanked the woman with a look that conveyed more than words ever could. She walked back out into the deep twilight, the laughter still dancing on the air, but it no longer felt like a knife in her heart. It felt like an invitation to participate. From her car, she retrieved the small, stuffed bear she had carried with her since the day her own world ended. It still smelled faintly of her son, of crayons and grass and innocence. It was the most precious thing she owned, and she knew, with a certainty that came from a place beyond thought, that it was the only offering that mattered. She walked back to the playground, the laughter seeming to quiet in anticipation. She pushed open the squeaking gate and stepped onto the soft, worn wood chips. She walked to the center of the play area, the place where the laughter was always the loudest, and knelt. She placed the small bear gently against the base of the slide, arranging it so it sat upright, as if watching the fun. "For you," she whispered into the cool air, the words not a sound, but a feeling released from her soul. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a profound and beautiful shift occurred. The laughter did not stop abruptly. It softened, transforming from a chorus of distinct voices into a single, sighing exhalation of pure, radiant joy. It rose, lifting up through the branches of the old oak trees, a shimmering ribbon of sound that unraveled into the stardusted sky. The shadowy figures on the swings and the roundabout brightened for a single, glorious second, their forms becoming pure golden light before they gently dissolved, like fireflies winking out one by one. A deep, peaceful silence descended, a silence that was no longer hollow, but full, a vessel that had been filled to the brim with grace. Maya stood, her body feeling lighter than it had in years, as if a weight she had forgotten she was carrying had been lifted from her shoulders. She did not look back as she walked to her car and drove away from Old Marbury. The village receded in her rearview mirror, a quiet cluster of lights in the vast, dark landscape. She did not feel the sharp, tearing grief that had been her constant companion for so long. In its place was a gentle, aching warmth. She had not found her son in that playground, but she had found a way to speak to him, to send a piece of her love into the quiet between worlds. The healing was not an end to the pain, but a transformation of it. The memory of her child was no longer a tombstone in her heart, but a small, bright star in her sky, and the silence that remained was no longer an enemy, but a companion, a space where love could finally, peacefully rest. The first thing Detective Harris noticed was the stillness. It was not the quiet of a sleeping village or the lull of a lazy afternoon. This was a profound, unnatural cessation, as if the entire world had been dipped in liquid glass. Darnley Cross lay before him under a flat, gray sky, a collection of stone cottages and a single, dusty lane, and not a single thing moved. A woman stood frozen halfway through, hanging a white sheet on a washing line, the fabric caught in a breeze that did not exist. A man was petrified in the act of chopping wood, his axe held high above his head, his muscles taut in a permanent strain. A black and white dog was a statue mid-yawn on a doorstep. Every single person, every animal, was locked in a single, arrested moment, and every one of them was facing the same direction, toward the dark, brooding line of woods that crowded the village's eastern edge. Harris stepped out of his car, the crunch of gravel under his shoes an obscenely loud violation of the silence. The air was cold and dead, carrying no scent of earth or hearth smoke, only the flat taste of dust. He walked slowly down the lane, his detective's mind cataloging the surreal tableaus. A baker's face was a mask of flour-dusted dread as he stared toward the trees. A child's toy cart lay on its side, its young owner frozen in the act of reaching for it, his small body angled toward the woods like a compass needle. There was no sound, no birdsong, no rustle of leaves, just the heavy, suffocating quiet of a paused film. The villagers were not simply still, they were waiting, their collective attention focused on the forest with an intensity that felt less like observation and more like supplication. He found the first sign of life. Near the village pump, an old man, so wizened he seemed to be made of bark and twine, was slowly, methodically drawing a bucket of water. His movements were fluid and real, a stark contrast to the petrified world around him. The man's eyes, milky with cataracts, slid toward Harris, but he did not startle. He finished his task, the groan of the pump handle and the splash of water shockingly loud. Harris approached, showing his badge. The old man merely nodded, as if he had been expecting him. His name was Elias, and his voice was a dry rustle. He explained the phenomenon in a matter-of-fact tone that was more disturbing than any hysterical account could have been. It was the time of waiting, he said. It happened every year on the anniversary. The village would fall into this trance, facing the woods, waiting for the lost one to return. The only ones unaffected were the very old, like himself, and the very new, the infants who had not yet learned the rhythm of the village's sorrow. When Harris asked who was lost, Elias' face crumpled further. A child, he whispered, a little boy named Thomas. He had wandered into the woods 70 years ago and never come out. And every year since, Darnley Cross stopped and waited, hoping that this would be the year he found his way home. Leaving Elias, Harris continued his investigation, the uncanny stillness pressing in on him. He moved through the frozen village like a ghost among ghosts. He entered the small post office. The postmistress was a statue behind the counter, her hand outstretched to give a stamp to a customer who was equally motionless. Both their faces were turned toward the window and the view of the woods beyond, their expressions a mixture of hope and deep ingrained fear. In the forge, the blacksmith was a silhouette against the cold, dark furnace, his hammer forever poised above an unmoving piece of iron. The silence in each building was a physical weight, a thick syrup that resisted movement and thought. Harris felt the strangeness of it seeping into his own bones. The poses were not just still, they were unnervingly specific, capturing a fraction of a second of mundane life with terrifying precision. A woman had a knitting needle halfway through a stitch. A man had a spoon lifted halfway to his parted lips. It was as if a giant, invisible hand had simply pressed a pause button on the entire village, leaving them trapped in the last moment before their collective attention was irrevocably stolen by the woods. Standing in the center of the silent lane, surrounded by the breathless vigil of an entire community, Harris felt a cold dread that had nothing to do with the temperature. This was not a crime scene in any conventional sense. It was a wound, a tear in the fabric of reality, and he was standing in the center of a grief so powerful and so old it had literally stopped time. The silence of Darnley Cross was a living entity, a vast, patient beast that had swallowed the village whole. Detective Harris moved through its belly, the crunch of his own footsteps a sacrilege against the profound hush. The frozen faces of the villagers, all turned toward the dark line of trees, were not merely still, they were pleading. Their collective trance was a prayer, a 70-year-long vigil for a lost child who had become the village's ghostly anchor. The old man's words echoed in his mind, the time of waiting. This was not a phenomenon to be solved by forensics or procedure. It was a wound in the world, and it demanded a different kind of resolution, one that spoke the language of spirits and sorrow. Leaving the petrified lane behind, Harris turned his own gaze toward the woods. The forest edge was a stark boundary, the neatly kept fields of the village giving way to a tangled wall of gnarled oaks and clutching undergrowth. The air grew colder as he approached, the dead stillness of the village replaced by a different kind of quiet, the watchful, breathing silence of an ancient place. He pushed through a curtain of ivy and stepped under the canopy, and the world changed. The flat gray light of the day fractured into a mosaic of deep greens and shifting shadows. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. Here at least there was sound, the faint rustle of something unseen moving through the brush, the drip of moisture from the leaves, the whisper of the wind in the high branches. It was a world that was still very much alive, and it felt like the true heart of the mystery. He walked deeper, his detective's mind searching for a sign, a clue that physical eyes could see. There were no paths, only the occasional game trail weaving between the thick trunks. He scanned the ground, the dense carpet of moss and fallen leaves, looking for anything that did not belong to the forest's own slow cycles of life and decay. An hour passed, then another. The woods seemed to close in around him, the trees pressing closer, the light growing dimmer. Just as a sense of futility began to creep in, his eyes caught a flash of unnatural color amidst the greens and browns. Tucked in the hollow formed by the massive, above-ground roots of an ancient oak was a small, sun-bleached scrap of blue fabric, fluttering like a forlorn flag. It was the brittle, faded blue of old cotton, the kind used for a child's overalls decades ago. His heart tightened in his chest. He moved toward the tree, his movements slow and reverent. Kneeling, he brushed away the layers of leaf litter and moss from the hollow. Beneath the fragile cloth, nestled amongst the roots as if the great tree itself had cradled them, lay a collection of small, delicate bones. They were scattered, but the shape was unmistakable, the tiny skeleton of a child. Time and the elements had cleaned them, leaving them pale and smooth as ivory. There was no horror in the sight, only a deep, overwhelming sadness. This was Thomas. He had not been lost, he had simply lain down here, tired from his wandering, and the forest had taken him into its quiet embrace, keeping his secret for 7 long decades. Harris knew what he had to do. This was not a case to be filed away. It was a story that needed its final chapter. He removed his coat and spread it on the ground beside the oak. With immense care, as if handling the most fragile evidence, he gathered each small bone, placing them gently in the center of the fabric. He worked with a solemn focus, the weight of the village's suspended grief his only companion. When every fragment was collected, he folded the coat into a careful bundle, a makeshift shroud for the long-awaited homecoming. He carried the small, light weight back through the woods, the journey out feeling shorter than the journey in. As he emerged from the tree line, the village of Darnley Cross lay before him, still locked in its breathless tableau. He walked to the small churchyard at the village's center, where headstones leaned like tired old teeth. Finding a quiet, sunny corner near a flowering hawthorn tree, he used his hands to dig a small, deep grave in the soft earth. He placed the bundle of bones inside, covering it gently with the dark, rich soil. He did not speak any words. The action itself was the only eulogy required. As the last handful of earth pattered down upon the grave, a sound broke the silence. It was a sharp, sudden intake of breath, a collective gasp that seemed to come from the village itself. Harris looked up. The woman at the washing line shuddered, her arms completing the motion of hanging the sheet. The thud of the woodsman's axe finally fell, biting deep into the chopping block. The dog on the doorstep finished its yawn with a soft whine and trotted off. All across Darnley Cross, life resumed. The trance was broken. The waiting was over. The villagers did not cheer or weep. They simply looked around, blinking as if waking from a deep sleep, their faces showing a gentle confusion that quickly settled in profound, weary relief. They saw Harris standing by the fresh-turned earth in the churchyard, and their eyes, one by one, met his. There were no words of thanks, only slow, deep nods of understanding, a silent transfer of a burden that had been carried for generations. The curse was not vanquished by force, but laid to rest with compassion. Harris got into his car and drove away, the village receding in his mirror, now alive with the ordinary, blessed sounds of life. He had come to Darnley Cross as a detective seeking a solution to a bizarre phenomenon, but he was leaving as something else entirely, a participant in an act of communal healing. The duty of his job had always been to find the truth, but he now understood that some truths were not meant to be merely uncovered. They were meant to be honored, and in that honoring, even a weary detective could find a sliver of his own redemption. Every village has its ghosts, but in this one they walked. Not as apparitions or chilling mists, but as a sound, the crisp, unmistakable rhythm of footsteps on cobblestones where no one stood. For Clara, a writer whose trade was in the architecture of the unseen, it was a siren's call. She arrived in the nameless hamlet tucked between 2 sleeping hills as evening began to bleed the color from the sky. The air was still and cool, carrying the damp, earthy scent of moss and old stone. The cottages were low and hunched, their windows dark, their gardens running wild with night-blooming flowers. And the lanes, a labyrinth of narrow, winding passages between the stone walls, were utterly, profoundly silent. It was a silence that felt deliberate, a held breath waiting to be broken. She had taken a room in the only lodging, a squat building that called itself an inn more out of hope than accuracy. Her room was small, overlooking the central lane, a ribbon of worn cobbles that gleamed faintly in the rising moonlight. The innkeeper, a gaunt man with eyes that held the weary patience of one who has heard too many questions, had given her the key with a wordless nod. When she had mentioned the village's reputation, his only response was a slow blink before he turned and retreated into the shadows of his taproom. The message was clear. Some curiosities were best experienced, not discussed. Night fell with a swift finality, draping the village in a deep, velvety blackness punctuated only by the sharp, white pinpricks of stars. Clara sat at her small desk, a notebook open before her, a cup of tea growing cold at her elbow. The silence was absolute, a physical weight in the room. and then it came, a single clear footstep on the cobbles below her window. It was not the scuff of a badger or the patter of a cat. It was the solid, purposeful tread of a leather sole on stone, then another, and another, a slow, steady pace, unhurried and resonant in the sleeping village. Her writer's heart leaped, not with fear, but with a fierce, consuming curiosity. She moved to the window. Pressing her face against the cool glass, the lane was empty. A sliver of moonlight painted the cobbles in silver and ink, revealing nothing but the long, distorted shadow of the inn itself. Yet the footsteps continued, pacing a slow, deliberate route down the lane and back again. They passed directly beneath her window, the sound crisp and close, then faded as they moved away, only to return moments later. It was a patrol, a lonely, eternal circuit of the silent lanes. Driven by an impulse she could not name, Clara pulled on her coat and slipped from her room, the old floorboards groaning a soft protest. The inn was tomb quiet. She unbolted the heavy front door and stepped out into the chill night air. The footsteps were clearer out here, echoing faintly off the stone walls. She followed the sound, her own soft-soled shoes making no noise on the damp stones. She turned a corner, the footsteps seeming to be just ahead, but the lane was empty. She quickened her pace, the sound always receding, always just out of sight around the next bend. She was a ghost chasing a ghost, led on a futile pursuit through the moonlit maze. Finally, breathless and chilled to the bone, she stopped in the center of a small crossroads. The footsteps paused for a moment, as if acknowledging her presence, and then resumed their lonely patrol, fading once more into the depths of the village. She was alone with the moon and the silence, the unseen walker having effortlessly eluded her. The next day she went in search of the story behind the sound. The village had no formal archive, but it had Elias, the same old man who had spoken to the detective from Darnley Cross, his memory a living library of local lore. He found her sitting on a bench by the dry village well, her notebook in her lap. He sat beside her, his gnarled hands resting on his knees, and without prompting he began to speak of the postman. His name was Arthur, he said. He had walked these lanes for 40 years, through rain and snow and blistering sun, a man as much a part of the village as the stones themselves. He knew every secret, carried every joy and sorrow in his leather satchel. One evening he did not return. They found him in one of the narrow lanes, his body cold, his satchel empty. His throat had been cut, a swift, brutal end for a gentle man. The murder was never found, the motive never known. But Arthur, it was said, could not rest. His duty was unfinished, his route unwalked. And so every night his spirit paced the silent lanes, forever making his rounds, his footsteps the only thing that remained of him. Clara listened, the old man's words painting a picture of a life defined by loyalty and cut short by a random, brutal act. The story settled deep within her, resonating with a familiar ache. As a writer, she too was a keeper of stories, a deliverer of truths. She felt a sudden, powerful connection to this phantom postman, this fellow traveler in the realm of the unfinished, his. Footsteps were not a haunting, they were a testament to a life of service, to a story violently interrupted, and to a truth that still waited patiently in the silent lanes for someone to finally deliver it. The story of the murdered postman, Arthur, settled into Clara's bones, a cold, hard truth that gave shape and sorrow to the phantom footsteps. They were no longer just an eerie phenomenon. They were the heartbeat of a silenced man, a metronome keeping time for a song of injustice that had been left unsung for decades. That night, as the familiar tread began its lonely circuit below her window, Clara did not try to follow. Instead, she lit a single candle, opened her notebook, and began to write. She wrote not as a chronicler of ghost stories, but as a conduit for a voice that had been stolen. She gave Arthur back his life on the page, his kindness, his dedication, the small, cherished details of his daily rounds. She gave him a family he never had, friends who missed him, and a village that felt his absence like a constant, dull ache. And then, with a fury that made her hand tremble, she wrote of his death not as a cold fact, but as a violation, a theft of light from a world that had too little of it to spare. She crafted a narrative where the truth was uncovered, where a forgotten clue was found, and where a faceless killer, though beyond the reach of mortal law, was named and shamed in the court of memory. She wrote until the candle guttered and died, and the first gray light of dawn touched the sky. She had given Arthur the justice the world had denied him, the resolution his spirit sought in its endless, restless pacing. Exhausted but cleansed, she slept through the morning. When she woke, the village was bathed in the soft, golden light of a clear afternoon, but a new compulsion had taken root in her. The story was written, but the ritual was not yet complete. The footsteps, she felt, were not just a lament, they were a guide, that evening. As twilight began to pool in the lanes, she stepped outside. The air was still, the village holding its breath, and then the sound began as it always did. But this time it was different. The rhythm was not its usual steady patrol. It was slower, more deliberate, and it led away from the central lane, down a narrow, overgrown footpath she had not noticed before, a track that seemed to dissolve into the thick hedgerow at the village's edge. Without hesitation, Clara followed. The footsteps were a clear, audible path before her, crunching on gravel that she could not see disturbed. The path wound between ancient hawthorn trees, their branches clutching at her coat like bony fingers, leading her to a small, forgotten clearing encircled by a low stone wall that had long since surrendered to ivy and moss. In the center of the clearing, beneath the sprawling limbs of a yew tree, was a low, unmarked mound of earth, so weathered it was nearly indistinguishable from the natural contours of the land. This was not a consecrated grave, it was a hiding place. The footsteps ceased. The silence that followed was not empty, but full, a listening quiet. Clara understood. This was where they had buried him, not in the churchyard with hymns and headstones, but here in secret, their shame and fear burying the truth along with the man. Kneeling on the damp earth, she reached into her bag and pulled out the small bunch of wildflowers she had gathered from the hedgerows on her walk: yarrow, foxglove, and a spray of white campion, their petals pale and pure in the fading light. She arranged them carefully at the head of the mound, a splash of color and life against the dark soil. It was a meager offering, but it was an acknowledgement. It was a headstone made of beauty instead of stone. As the last flower was placed, a profound sense of peace descended upon the clearing. The oppressive, waiting stillness that had clung to the village for so long simply lifted, as if a great, silent sigh had been released into the twilight. The tension in the air dissolved, replaced by the gentle, ordinary sounds of the coming night, a blackbird's evening song, the rustle of a hedgehog in the undergrowth. The footsteps did not return. Back in her room, Clara opened her notebook to a fresh page. She wrote the final chapter of her book, the story of the postman, now complete. But her own story had been transformed. She wrote of the weight of untold truths and the quiet power of remembrance. She explored how a story could be a kind of resurrection, and how an act of witness, however small, could be a form of absolution for both the remembered and the one who remembers. The phantom footsteps had been a question echoing through the decades, and in writing his story and honoring his grave, she had finally offered an answer. She finished her book as the true night settled, the village of the silent lanes resting more deeply and peacefully than it had in living memory. Clara packed her bags, the manuscript a tangible weight in her case, heavier with meaning than with pages. She had come to listen to a ghost story and had ended up participating in a restoration. As she drove away the next morning, the lanes were silent, but the silence was no longer that of a held breath. It was the deep, clean quiet of a story that had, at long last, reached its final, peaceful full stop. The first thing the Millers noticed about the cottage was the dust. It wasn't the benign, sleepy dust of a place long vacant, but a fine silver-gray powder that seemed to have settled with a deliberate finality, coating every surface like a shroud. The cottage itself was a picture of rustic charm from the outside, nestled in a secluded valley where the only sounds were the whisper of the wind through the pines and the distant cry of a buzzard. It was the perfect escape for Mark and Lisa, a chance to leave the city's noise and haste behind, a fresh start for them and their two children, Chloe and Sam. But as they carried their boxes across the threshold, the children hung back, their small faces pinched with an unease that had nothing to do with the move. It was Chloe, with the hyper-awareness of a 10-year-old, who saw them first. "People in the windows," she whispered, her voice small and tight as she clutched her mother's hand. Lisa followed her gaze across the overgrown garden to the neighboring cottage, a darker, more brooding structure of blackened stone. The windows were dark, the glass grimy, but in the uppermost window, the one set into the steep pitch of the attic, a pale, indistinct face seemed to be pressed against the pane. It was there for a moment, a smudge of white in the deep shadow, and then it was gone. Lisa dismissed it as a trick of the light, a reflection of a passing cloud on dirty glass, and chivied the children inside. But the feeling of being watched did not fade. It intensified, becoming a constant, low-grade hum of disquiet. Over the next few days, as they unpacked and arranged their new life, the attic windows of the surrounding cottages became a focal point of a silent, unsettling vigil. There were 3 other houses visible from their garden, each one as still and silent as a tomb, their gardens running wild, their chimneys cold. And in the high, small windows of each attic, the figures would appear. They were never clear, never more than a suggestion of a human form, a shift of shadow, a pallid oval where a face might be, the faint impression of a hand resting on the glass. They did not move or gesture. They simply were, their silent observation a pressure that slowly filled the valley. Sam, at 7, began having nightmares, waking the house with screams about the quiet people in the roofs. He refused to play in the back garden, his eyes constantly drawn upward to the blank, watching windows. Mark, a pragmatic man who built his life on visible, tangible things, tried to laugh it off, blaming overactive imaginations and the strangeness of a new place. But even he could not entirely ignore the creeping sensation that descended each evening, the feeling that as the light failed, the attention from the attics grew sharper, more focused. The family found themselves drawing the curtains early, creating a bright, defiant island of light in the encroaching dark. but it did little to dispel the sense that just beyond the glass, a silent audience was gathering. Driven by a need for a rational explanation, Mark decided to investigate. The next morning, he walked over to the nearest neighbor, the occupant of the Blackstone cottage. The garden was a jungle of nettles and brambles, and the front door, when he knocked, was answered not by a person but by a hollow, echoing sound from within. The door was unlocked. Pushing it open, he was met with a cavernous silence and the thick, sweet smell of decay. The ground floor was empty, stripped bare, a layer of that same silver-gray dust covering the floorboards, a set of narrow, steep stairs led upward to the attic. His heart thudding a slow, heavy rhythm, Mark climbed. The attic was a single, long room under the eaves, empty save for a single, straight-backed wooden chair positioned directly in front of the small, grimy window that looked out toward his own cottage. On the floor beside the chair lay a small, leather-bound book, its cover brittle and cracked. He picked it up, the leather flaking away under his fingers. It was a diary. The handwriting inside was a tight, frantic script, the entries spanning only a few weeks. The last one was chillingly brief. "They are waiting for me to join them. I can see their lights in the other attics. We never truly leave this place. We just watch." The final words trailed off into an ink blot, as if the writer had been interrupted or simply given up. Mark stood in the silent, dusty attic, the diary in his hand, the empty chair before the window a stark testament to its author's fate. The figures were not a trick of the light, they were residents, and according to the desperate scrawl in his hand, they were residents who never, ever left. The diary in Mark's hand felt less like paper and more like a piece of someone's petrified fear. The frantic, final entry echoed in the silent attic, its words giving a terrible voice to the pale, watching faces. "We never truly leave this place. We just watch." He descended the narrow stairs, the dust motes swirling in the slants of light like agitated spirits, the weight of the discovery settling upon him. This was no longer a matter of overactive imaginations or rural superstition. The Millers were not merely living near abandoned homes. They were neighbors to a gallery of trapped souls, bound to the attics by some unseen chain of regret. He returned to his family, the truth a cold stone in his stomach. He showed Lisa the diary, her face paling as she read the desperate script. They agreed to tell the children a gentler version, one that spoke of sad ghosts who needed help, not scary monsters to be feared. To their surprise, Chloe and Sam absorbed this new reality with a child's solemn acceptance, their fear transforming into a sense of purpose. The family, once fractured by the unease, found a new bond in the shared mission. They were no longer just residents. They were interlopers in a story that had paused mid-sentence, and it fell to them to find a way to turn the page. The key, they realized, lay in the diaries and the detritus the previous occupants had left behind. Over the following days, they conducted a quiet, respectful investigation of the neighboring cottages. Each attic told a similar story: a single chair by the window, a layer of silver dust, and a hidden, papery heartache. In one, they found a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon, all addressed to a sweetheart in a distant city, but never sent. The writer's regret was a palpable ache in the ink. He had been too afraid to declare his love, and had lived a life of quiet solitude, forever watching the road he was too timid to travel. In another attic, they found a child's toy, a carved wooden soldier, left behind when a family had fled a financial scandal. The father's shame so profound his spirit remained, eternally gazing out at the life he felt he had failed to provide. The figures in the windows became more distinct to the Millers, not in form, but in essence. They could now feel the specific texture of each ghost's sorrow, the bitter tang of cowardice, the hollow ache of abandonment, the sharp sting of a promise broken. The silent vigil was not one of menace, but of profound, immobilized longing. These were souls anchored to the world by the weight of what they had left undone. The Millers decided to act. They would become postmen for the dead, deliverers of absolution. Lisa carefully packaged the unsent love letters and mailed them to the descendants of the intended recipient, now an old woman living in a coastal town. Mark took the wooden soldier, and after some research, located the now elderly son of the disgraced businessman, returning the toy with a note that spoke only of a father's enduring love, not his failure. Chloe and Sam drew pictures for the ghost of a woman who had longed for children, leaving them on the chair in her attic. They performed these small, quiet acts not as a grand exorcism, but as simple, human kindnesses, tying up the loose ends that regret had left frayed. They worked through the list, fulfilling each unfinished wish they could decipher. With each completed task, a subtle shift occurred in the valley. The oppressive, watchful pressure would lessen. One evening, as the family sat in their garden, they saw a soft, golden light bloom in the attic window of the Blackstone cottage, the one with the unsent letters. It was a warm, gentle light, not the cold phosphorescence of a specter, and it grew brighter and brighter until, with a soft sigh that seemed to ripple through the very air, it gently winked out. The following night, the same happened to the cottage of the disgraced father. One by one, the attic windows that had held their pale, silent watchers for decades emptied, not with a bang, but with a benediction of light and a final released breath. The change in the atmosphere was immediate and profound. The silver dust that had coated their own cottage seemed to lose its grim finality, becoming simple dust again. The air in the valley felt lighter, cleaner, as if a long-held breath had finally been exhaled. The children played in the garden without looking over their shoulders, their laughter now the loudest sound in the quiet clearing. The sense of being watched was gone, replaced by a deep, resonant peace. On their final night, the Millers stood together on their porch, looking out at the dark, silent cottages. The attic windows were just black squares against darker roofs, empty and still. There were no more pale faces, no more silent pleas. They had helped the watchers. Their rest, and in doing so, had found a profound sense of their own unity. The haunting had not driven them apart. It had woven them together more tightly, proving that the strongest bonds are often forged not in comfort, but in shared purpose and compassion. The cottage was no longer just a house. It was a home, its peace earned, its silence now a comfort. They had learned that some houses are haunted not by malice, but by memory, and that the key to laying any ghost to rest is not to banish it, but to listen, to understand, and to finally, gently offer it closure. Every village has its secret, but in this one the secret spoke. It began not as a sound, but as a pressure, a subtle vibration in the air that traveler James felt the moment his boots touched the dusty main street of the nameless hamlet. The sun was a white, merciless eye in a bleached sky, bleaching the color from the stone cottages and baking the earth to a hard, cracked crust. Yet, despite the arid heat, a deep, pervasive chill seemed to radiate from the center of the village, a cold spot that had nothing to do with the weather. It emanated from the wells. There were 3 of them, spaced at intervals along the street, their circular mouths built of the same pale, local stone as the cottages. But unlike any wells James had ever seen, these were not open to the sky. They were sealed by shadows, not the natural shade of an overhanging tree, but by a clinging, liquid darkness that pooled within their stone rims, a blackness so absolute it seemed to swallow the very light around it. He had stopped for water, his canteen long since drained, but the sight of those wells froze him in his tracks. The shadows coiled and shifted like restless smoke, and from their depths came the whispers. At first, they were a mere susurration, the sound of a distant, indecipherable crowd. But as he stood there, parched and weary, one thread of sound separated itself from the chorus, weaving through the hot, still air. To hook directly into his mind, it was his name, not shouted, not called, but breathed with an intimate, knowing familiarity. James. The sound was a cold finger tracing the line of his spine. It was impossible. He knew no one here. He had told no one his name. Yet the whisper came again, clearer this time, a sibilant, beckoning sigh that seemed to originate from the nearest well. It pulled at him, a physical tug in the pit of his stomach, an almost gravitational lure toward that circle of waiting darkness. He took a hesitant step forward, his thirst forgot, replaced by a deep, primal curiosity. The whisper repeated his name, layering it now with a tone of welcome, of profound recognition, as if something in that impossible dark had been waiting for him, and only him, for a very long time. He was within 10 feet of the well's stone rim when a hand clamped onto his arm, the grip surprisingly strong. He started, wrenching his gaze from the hypnotic darkness to find an old woman at his side, her face a mask of sun-wrinkled leather, her eyes wide with a frantic urgency. She pulled him back, her strength belying her frail appearance. She did not speak, only shook her head, her gaze darting between his face and the shadow-clogged well, her fear a silent, screaming warning. She dragged him away from the street, into the cool, dim interior of a nearby cottage. Inside, a few other villagers were gathered, their faces etched with the same deep-seated dread. They offered him water from a clay jug, their hands trembling, and then in hushed, hurried tones they told him the tales. They spoke of travelers who, like him, had heard their names called from the wells. They spoke of those who had been drawn closer, who had peered into the whispering dark, and who had simply leaned in. They never made a sound. There was no splash, no cry. One moment they were there, their forms silhouetted against the circle of shadow, and the next they were gone, vanished as if they had never been. The wells took them, the villagers whispered, their voices dropping to a terrified murmur. The whispers were lures, the shadows a mouth, and the village lived in the constant, terrified shadow of their silent, hungry presence. To answer the call was to be erased. The villagers' warnings were a cold anchor in the swirling, seductive pull of the whispers. James sat in the dim cottage, the clay cup of water in his hand forgot, the old woman's terrified grip still a phantom brand on his arm. The stories they told were not folklore, they were obituaries for the curious, a litany of names swallowed by the shadowy throats of the wells. The initial gravitational lure he had felt curdled into a sharp, metallic fear. The whispers were not a welcome, they were a predator's mimicry, a spider's web woven from sound. The wells were not sources of water, but of something far more insidious. They were gateways. That night, he lay on a thin pallet in a back room of the cottage, the silence of the village a heavy, listening presence. Sleep was impossible. The whispers had not ceased with the setting sun. If anything, they grew stronger in the dark, slithering under the door and through the cracks in the stone walls. They were a multi-voiced chorus now, a tapestry of temptation woven from his own memories and desires. They promised cool, clear water for his parched throat, a soft bed for his weary bones, answers to questions he had never dared to ask. They whispered of a place without pain, without the weight of the road, a silent, peaceful realm just beyond the veil of shadow. They spoke his name with a lover's intimacy, a friend's camaraderie, a father's pride, every tone calibrated to bypass his reason and speak directly to the lonely, yearning core of him. The pull was a physical ache, a hook set deep in his soul, and the shadow-clogged well in the center of the village was the line, reeling him in. He fought it, clenching his fists, until his nails bit into his palms. Using the pain as a focus, he thought of the villagers' faces, their resigned terror. He thought of the travelers who had vanished, their stories ending not with a period, but with an ellipsis into nothingness. He understood now that the wells were portals, not to another place in this world, but to a spirit realm, a dimension of silent, hungry ghosts who fed on the living, luring them in with psychic bait. To answer the call was not to die. It was to be unmade, consumed, your essence added to the whispering chorus to help lure the next victim. The ritual the old woman had described to him, the one they used to temporarily strengthen the seals on the wells, was not a superstition. It was a desperate act of self-preservation, a dam against a metaphysical tide. As the moon reached its zenith, casting a sickly silver light over the village, James could resist no longer. Not the pull, but the need to confront it. He rose from the pallet, his movements silent. He gathered the items the villagers had given him, a pouch of dried, bitter herbs, a small, smooth river stone, and a vial of salt. These were the simple, earthy components of their warding ritual. He slipped out of the cottage into the cold, still night. The central well awaited him, its circular mouth a pool of absolute blackness that seemed to writhe and pulse in the moonlight. The whispers coalesced into a single, focused voice, his own voice, calling him home. The tug was immense, a riptide threatening to drag him off his feet. He could feel the spirits on the other side, their presence a vast, cold emptiness, a hunger that had not been sated in centuries. They wanted him. They needed his light to fill their void. His hands trembled as he knelt a safe distance from the stone rim, the cold of the earth seeping through his trousers. He could not look directly into the shadow. Its hypnotic pull was too strong. Instead, he focused on the ritual. He poured the salt in a wide circle around himself, a barrier of purity against the spiritual corruption. He crushed the dried herbs in his palm. Their sharp, cleansing sent a tiny rebellion against the cloying psychic pressure and scattered them toward the well. The whispers faltered for a second, hissing with static, as if the very air had been scorched. Finally, he held the smooth river stone, imbuing it with all his will, all his defiance, all his desire to live. This was not just a stone, it was an anchor, a symbol of the solid, real world he refused to leave. He did not chant or shout. He simply stood, his gaze fixed on the stone in his hand, and in his mind he built a wall. He built it from memories of sun on his face, of wind in the trees, of the weight of his own body and the sound of his own heart. He built it from the simple, profound truth of his own existence. He pushed this wall of self out toward the well, a silent, psychic rejection of the lure. The reaction was immediate and violent. The whispering shadows convulsed, boiling up. From the well's mouth in a wave of formless, screaming darkness, the air temperature plummeted, frosting his breath. The psychic pull became a shriek of frustrated rage. 1,000 silent voices denied their meal, but the salt held. The scent of the herbs was a shield. The stone in his hand was a bedrock. He stood his ground, pouring every ounce of his being into that refusal, into the simple, powerful act of saying no. The struggle seemed to last an eternity, locked in that silent, desperate combat of wills. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The wave of darkness collapsed back into the well, the furious whispers subsiding into a defeated, receding hiss. The clinging shadows within the stone rim seemed to shrink, to solidify, their restless movement stilling into a dormant, sealed darkness. The oppressive cold lifted. The pull was gone. The well was silent. Exhausted, drenched in a cold sweat, James stumbled back to the cottage as the first hint of dawn grayed the sky. The villagers were waiting, their faces etched with a hope they had not dared to feel in years. He had not just resisted, he had reinforced their ward, adding his own will to the centuries of desperate defense. He had saved himself, but in doing so, he had helped seal the hungry mouth of the well, at least for a time. He left the village as the sun rose, its light revealing the dusty, ordinary street in the three wells, now just dark circles of stone, their shadows seeming thinner, less profound. Carried no trophy, no great wisdom, only a cold, sober understanding. The world was full of such thresholds, places where curiosity could be a fatal flaw. He had stared into the whispering dark and learned the most valuable lesson of his travels, that some doors are never meant to be opened, and the most profound knowledge one can possess is the wisdom to turn away. The unknown was not always a mystery to be solved. Sometimes it was a warning to be heeded, a silence that begged to be left. Unbroken, the scent of fresh bread and roasted meat was the first thing to greet Nina, a cruel and tantalizing welcome to a village that smelled of life but felt like a tomb. She had come to the nameless hamlet tucked between two barren hills, chasing whispers of a different kind, not of ghosts but of absences. The stories spoke of vanishings, not in the dead of night or from shadowy lanes, but in the heart of the home at the very moment of sustenance. People disappeared, the accounts claimed, leaving behind tables set with warm, steaming meals, the chairs pushed back as if the occupants had merely stepped away for a moment, never to return. The reality was more unsettling than the reports. As she walked the single, dusty street in the late afternoon light, the air was thick with the aromas of a dozen simultaneous dinners. Through unshuttered windows, she saw tables laid with plates of food, pots still bubbling on stoves, glasses of wine half full. But there were no people, no cooks. Tending the hearths, no families gathered to eat, no sounds of cutlery or conversation. The village was a stage set for a feast, populated only by the ghosts of appetite. The silence was not one of peace, but of interruption, as if a conductor had cut off an orchestra mid-crescendo, leaving the notes hanging, unresolved in the air. Her first stop was the home of Alara, the woman who had initially contacted her newspaper. Alara's cottage was a portrait of suspended life. Stew simmered on the iron range, its rich, herby scent filling the small kitchen. Two places were set at the wooden table, a ladle rested in the pot, and a warm, crusty loaf sat on a cutting board, a single slice missing. It was here, Alara explained, her voice a hushed tremor, that her husband had vanished 3 weeks prior. One moment he was blowing on a spoonful of stew to cool it, complaining about the price of seed, and the next he was simply not there. The spoon had clattered to the floor. The chair was empty, the stew was still hot. Nina interviewed others, their stories weaving a terrifying pattern. A farmer vanished while carving a Sunday roast. 2 children disappeared from their breakfast table, their porridge bowls still warm to the touch. An old man, known for his punctuality, was gone between the kettle's whistle and the pouring of his tea. The vanishings were instantaneous, clean, and tied irrevocably to the act of eating. But the most chilling detail, the one that set Nina's journalist's instincts humming, was the timing. They all occurred at the same precise moments: 7:17 in the morning, 12:08 in the afternoon, and 6:55 in the evening. The village was keeping a dreadful, invisible schedule. As dusk began to settle, painting the sky in shades of violet and rose, Nina stood in the center of the empty street, her notebook filled with identical, horrifying accounts. The pattern was clear, but the cause was a maddening blank. She felt the weight of the village's silent panic. Unasked question hanging in the savory air: who would be next? The designated time for the evening vanishing, 6:55 p.m., was fast approaching. A deep, instinctual dread told her to leave, to drive away from this beautiful, fragrant nightmare. But the story was here, a truth buried in the warmth of abandoned meals. Compelled, she approached the village well, not to draw water, but to think. She leaned against its cold stone rim, the notebook in her hand, trying to piece the fragments together. And that was when it happened. The world did not fade or darken, but it stuttered. The golden light of the setting sun flickered, and for a single heart-stopping second, it was replaced by the harsh, white light of midday. The scent of evening dew vanished, replaced by the dry, dusty heat of noon. The silence was broken by the raucous caw of a crow that had not been there a moment before, and in that impossible sliver of overlapped time, she saw them, a group of villagers in old-fashioned homespun clothes gathered around the well, their faces drawn with a fear she recognized. They were looking at something in the sky, their mouths open in a silent scream. Then, as swiftly as it had come, the vision was gone. The sun was setting again, the air was cool, and the village was silent. Nina stood frozen, her heart hammering against her ribs, the scent of roasting meat from a nearby cottage now smelling not just of loss, but of a terrible trans-temporal hunger. She had not just been investigating a mystery, she had just experienced it. The vanishings were not a spatial phenomenon, they were a temporal one. The village was not being emptied, it was being peeled back, layer by layer, and she had just caught a glimpse of the raw, bleeding past beneath. The afterimage of the past was seared onto Nina's vision, the terrified faces, the harsh noon sun, the silent scream. The scent of roasting meat from a nearby cottage now seemed to curdle in the air, the aroma of a feast. Transformed into the stench of a sacrificial offering, the vanishings were not random abductions, they were erasures, snatchings from the flow of time itself. The village was caught in a temporal loop, a weak spot in the fabric of reality where the past was hungry, and it fed during the precise, vulnerable moments when people were most present in their own lives, during a meal. Her mind, trained to connect disparate facts, raced. The specific times of the disappearances were not arbitrary. They were synchronized with a past event, a cataclysm that had torn a rift. The villagers gathered at the well in her vision were not just frightened, they were witnessing the birth of the anomaly. The key to stopping it lay not in the present, but in understanding and sealing that original wound. She hurried back to Alara's cottage, the woman's face a mask of fresh dread as the clock ticked closer to 6:55 p.m. Nina demanded to see the village's oldest records, anything that spoke of a disaster, a strange celestial event, or a mass disappearance from the past. What they found in a locked chest in the church vestry was not a written record, but an object. Wrapped in brittle, yellowed linen was a stone disc, about the size of a dinner plate. It was intricately carved with spiraling patterns that seemed to shift and writhe when looked at directly, and at its center was a milky, opalescent crystal that pulsed with a faint, inner light. It was cold to the touch, a deep spatial cold that had nothing to do with temperature. An inscription on the linen, faded to near illegibility, called it the Chronos Anchor, a relic said to have been used by the village's founders to bind the hours to the land. The legend spoke of a day when the sky had torn, and a great pulling had threatened to unmake the village until the anchor was used to stitch time back together. The event was recorded as having occurred at midday, and the final, desperate ritual was performed as the sun set. The pieces clicked into place with the force of a thunderclap. The anomaly was a recurring tear, a cyclical wound that reopened at the same moments it was originally sealed, the moments of the vanishings. The anchor wasn't just a legend, it was a tool, a temporal stabilizer. But it had been dormant, its power faded, treating the symptoms of the rift for generations by sacrificing a few, rather than healing the tear itself. To stop the vanishings forever, she would have to use the anchor not as a bandage, but as a suture at the exact epicenter of the rupture. The epicenter, she knew with a sudden, chilling certainty, was the well. It was the constant, the focal point she had seen in her vision. As the clock in the church tower began to chime the quarter hour, warning of the 6:55 event, Nina ran, the heavy stone disc clutched in her arms. The village around her seemed to warp and shimmer. Through windows, she saw flickering afterimages of past meals, of families laughing and then freezing in. Mid-gesture as the air around them thickened, the pull she had felt earlier was back, a dizzying, vertiginous sensation of being untethered, of time itself becoming a riptide trying to drag her into its depths. She reached the well as the final chime began to sound. The air grew thick and heavy, buzzing with static. The world began to double expose itself, the twilight of the present overlaid with the stark light of the past catastrophe. She could see the ghostly forms of the long-ago villagers, their panic a silent scream echoing through the years. The rift was opening. She could feel its hunger, a vast temporal maw ready to consume whoever was caught in its field during this vulnerable moment. With a strength born of pure desperation, she raised the Chronos Anchor high and slammed its carved surface against the stone rim of the well. The moment the central crystal made contact, a shockwave of silent energy erupted outwards. The milky stone blazed with a pure white light, and the carved spirals on the disc began to spin, not physically but in perception, weaving threads of reality back into place. The buzzing static peaked into a deafening roar that had no sound. The overlapping timelines convulsed, the past and present fighting for dominance. Nina held on, her arms trembling, her will the only thing anchoring her to the present as the vortex of broken time tried to claim her, too. Then, with a final, gut-wrenching lurch, it was over. The light from the anchor faded back to a gentle, steady pulse. The double vision ceased. The oppressive pulling sensation vanished, leaving behind the simple, cool quiet of a village evening. The sense of a dozen abandoned meals still hung in the air, but the terrible, waiting silence was gone. The temporal rift had been stabilized, its hungry mouth sewn shut by the ancient artifact. Nina slid to the ground, her body spent, the Chronos Anchor resting heavily in her lap. She looked at her watch. It was 6:56 p.m. No one had vanished. Up and down the street, she saw faces appear at windows, not with fear, but with a dawning, bewildered hope. The curse was broken. Weeks later, back in her city apartment, Nina finished her story. She wrote of warm meals and cold terror, of a village trapped in a loop of its own history. But the heart of her article was not the mystery, but its resolution. She wrote of the fragility of time, of how the past is not a sealed book, but a living current that runs just beneath the surface of the present, and how easily the membrane between them can be torn. The Chronos Anchor now rested in a museum, its work done, a silent testament to the idea that some wounds are not of flesh and blood, but of seconds and minutes, and that the most profound piece is the simple, uninterrupted flow of one moment into the next. The story was published, a warning and a wonder, emphasizing that time, for all its relentless power, is the most delicate thing of all. The first thing Tom noticed was the smile. It was his own face, his own features, reflected back at him from the age-spotted mirror behind the bar, but the expression was wrong. He had just taken a long, weary pull from his pint, the bitter ale a welcome anchor after a day of driving down rain-slicked country lanes. His own mood was a gray, damp thing, a quiet melancholy that had settled deep in his bones. But the man in the mirror was grinning, a wide, easy, carefree smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes, a smile Tom hadn't felt on his own face in years. He froze, the glass halfway back to the polished wood of the bar, his own reflection's unwavering cheer a bizarre and unsettling sight. He consciously schooled his features back into a neutral line, but the man in the mirror kept right on smiling, his eyes twinkling with a secret amusement. Tom blinked, shook his head slightly, and looked again. The smile was gone. His reflection now mimicked his own tired, somber expression perfectly. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, chalking it up to a trick of the low, flickering light from the fire and the fatigue of the road. The pub, the Gilded Glass, was a classic village local, all dark, worm-eaten beams, a crackling hearth, and the faint, sweet smell of spilled beer and old tobacco. It was crowded for a weeknight, a low hum of conversation filling the space, but the atmosphere was thick with something more than just conviviality. There was a tension in the air, a watchfulness that he felt on the back of his neck. His eyes began to wander, drawn to the other mirrors that adorned the walls. They were everywhere in all shapes and sizes, ornate gilt-framed ovals, simple squares of smoked glass, even a large, cracked one near the dartboard that seemed to swallow the light. And in each one he saw the same subtle wrongness. A man at a corner table was frowning into his whiskey, but his reflection was leaning back, laughing soundlessly at some private joke. A woman by the fire was intently studying her phone, but her mirror image was staring directly at Tom, her gaze thoughtful and penetrating before she turned away to mimic the real woman's posture a second too late. The movements were not perfectly synchronized. There was a lag, a fractional delay, or sometimes an anticipation, as if the reflections were living a half-second ahead of or behind their originals. They were echoes with a life of their own. A cold knot of unease tightened in his stomach. This was no trick of the light. He caught the eye of the bartender, a stout, balding man with a towel perpetually slung over his shoulder, who was watching him with a knowing, almost pitying expression. Tom gestured him over, his voice a low murmur. "The mirrors," he began, unsure how to phrase the impossible. "They're odd." The bartender didn't laugh or dismiss him. He simply nodded, his eyes grave. He leaned in close, the scent of hops and brine on his breath. "Aye," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They are. That we don't talk about it much with outsiders. But the story goes, this place sits on a thin spot. The mirrors aren't just showing us. Sometimes they're showing them." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "Parallel world, they say, a reflection of our own, but not quite. And sometimes the glass gets porous." He gave Tom a long, significant look before moving away to pull a pint for another customer, leaving Tom with a chilling new reality. Tom turned back to his own reflection in the spotted glass. The man who looked back at him now wore his same tired expression, but there was a new sharpness in the mirrored eyes, a glint of intelligence that felt alien. Was it just his imagination, or was his reflection studying him just as intently? He felt a growing, profound disquiet, the cozy warmth of the pub suddenly feeling claustrophobic. The low chatter of the patrons, the clink of glasses, the crackle of the fire, it all receded, replaced by the silent, watchful presence of the dozens of mirrored faces around the room. He was no longer just a patron having a drink. He was a specimen under glass, being observed from the other side, and the smile he had seen earlier now felt less like a friendly gesture and more like the confident grin of a predator that has just spotted its prey. The disquiet that had begun as a faint prickle was now a cold, crawling certainty deep in Tom's marrow. The pub, the Gilded Glass, was no longer a refuge of warm wood and cheerful noise. It was a cage lined with silvered glass, and he was the main exhibit. Every mirror in the place felt like an eye, and every reflection held a secret life just beyond his comprehension. The bartender's whispered warning, a parallel world, echoed in his mind, transforming the cozy interior into a landscape of subtle, shifting threats. He could feel the porousness of the glass, the psychic seepage from the other side. His own reflection, which had moments ago mirrored his weary slump, now held its posture with a straighter spine, its gaze sharper, more assessing. It was no longer just mimicking him. It was studying him, learning the map of his face, the language of his weariness. He decided to leave, the half-finished pint on the bar a monument to his shattered peace. He stood, the movement feeling clumsy and loud, and made for the door. But as he passed the large, cracked mirror near the dartboard, his reflection did not move with him. It remained standing by the bar, one hand resting on the polished wood where his own glass had been, its head tilted in a gesture of cool appraisal. Tom froze, his blood turning to ice. In the mirror, the reflection turned its head slowly, meeting his horrified gaze directly. And then it smiled again, that same easy, carefree grin, but now it held no warmth. It was a smile of ownership, of anticipation. A wave of dizziness washed over him, the pub tilting on its axis. The sounds of the real world, the chatter, the clinking glasses, faded into a muffled hum replaced by a high, thin ringing in his ears. The air grew thick and heavy, pressing in on him, and the light from the fire and the lamps seemed to dim, their warmth leaching away into a sterile, silver glow that emanated from the mirrors themselves. He was no longer just looking at a reflection, he was being pulled towards it. The mirror's surface ceased to be a solid barrier and became a viscous, shimmering film, a gateway. He could see through it now, into the pub on the other side. It was a perfect replica of the gilded glass, but empty, silent, and lit by that same cold internal luminescence. And standing there in that ghostly duplicate was his reflection, not a flat image, but a three-dimensional living double, its hand outstretched as if inviting him in or perhaps preparing to step out. The truth crashed down upon him with the force of a physical blow. This was no mere haunting. The pub was a junction, a weak point between two worlds. The reflections were not just echoes, they were the inhabitants of that other dimension, a ghostly, parasitic race of doppelgangers, and they wanted to cross over. They wanted to swap places, to wear his life like a suit of clothes, trapping him forever in their silent, silvered prison. His own reflection was not just watching him, it was preparing to steal him. Panic, pure and undiluted, flooded his system. He stumbled backward, away from the beckoning figure in the large mirror, but his movements felt sluggish, as if he were fighting through deep water. The pull from the gateway was a tangible force, a psychic riptide trying to drag him into the glass. He could feel his doubles will pressing against his own, an alien consciousness trying to overwrite his mind, to unmake his identity and claim it for its own. The reflection's smile widened, its eyes now holding a terrifying, possessive light. It took a step forward, its form beginning to blur at the edges, preparing to phase through the weakening barrier. Tom's back hit the solid wood of the bar, the impact jarring him back into a moment of clarity. He was trapped. The door seemed 1,000 miles away. His eyes darted wildly around the room, landing on a heavy, cast-iron stool near the dartboard. The self-preservation instinct was a raw, screaming thing in his head. If the glass was the gateway, then the glass had to break. With a guttural cry that tore from a place of primal terror, he lunged for the stool, his muscles screaming in protest against the otherworldly pull. He hefted its solid weight, turning toward the large, cracked mirror. His reflection's face contorted from a smile into a mask of furious alarm. It raised its hands, not in surrender, but in a frantic, warding gesture, a silent scream of denial forming on its lips. Tom did not hesitate. He put all his strength, all his fear, all his desperate will to remain himself, into the swing. The impact was not a simple shattering of glass. It was an explosion of light and sound, a deafening, high-frequency shriek that seemed to come from the fabric of reality itself. A shockwave of pure energy blasted out from the mirror, throwing Tom backward onto the floor. Shards of silvered glass rained down like jagged hail, but they did not clatter. They dissolved into motes of shimmering dust before they could hit the ground. The cold, sterile light from the other side flared into a blinding white nova and then vanished, snuffed out like a candle. Silence descended, thick and absolute. The oppressive pull was gone. The ringing in his ears ceased. Tom lay on the rough floorboards, gasping for air, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He pushed himself up, his body trembling uncontrollably. Where the large mirror had been, there was now only a blank expanse of soot-stained wall. He looked around the pub. The other mirrors were just mirrors again, showing the stunned, frightened faces of the real patrons, who were staring at him and the empty space on the wall with a mixture of shock and dawning relief. The reflections were perfectly synchronized, their movements once more mere echoes of their originals. The gateway was sealed. He staggered out of the gilded glass into the cool, blessedly normal night air, leaving the stunned silence of the pub behind him. He did not look back. As he walked away on shaking legs, the lesson of the evening settled deep within him, colder and harder than any shard of glass. The confrontation had not been with a monster, but with a distorted version of himself. The true terror was not the existence of another world, but the fragility of his own identity, the terrifying ease with which it could be copied, coveted, and stolen. He had escaped by destroying the medium that allowed the theft, but he knew he would forever carry the memory of that possessive smile in the glass. He had learned that the most important battle a person can fight is the one to remain who they are, and that sometimes the most dangerous reflection is your own. The road did not so much end as it simply gave up. One moment, Leo was guiding their car along a winding ribbon of sun-warmed asphalt, the green swell of the hills unfolding around them, the map on Mia's lap promising a village just around the next bend. The next moment, the road behind them was gone. Not obscured by fog or fallen trees, but vanished, replaced by an unbroken expanse of ancient, gnarled oaks and clutching undergrowth that looked as if it had stood for 1,000 years. It was as if the tarmac had been a film reel and someone had spliced it out, seamlessly stitching the primordial forest back into place. Leo slammed on the brakes, the car lurching to a halt. He and Mia stared, dumbfounded, through the rear window. The lane they had just driven down, the one that had curved gently away just seconds ago, was no longer there. In its place was a solid, impassable wall of vegetation, the deep shadows between the trunks holding a silence that felt older than sound itself. What, how? Mia's voice was a thin, bewildered thread. She twisted in her seat, her eyes wide, scanning the impossible view. There were no tire marks leading into the woods, no scar in the earth to show where the road had been. It was just forest. A cold, formless dread began to uncoil in Leo's stomach. He He put the car in reverse and pressed the accelerator. The tires spun on the asphalt, but the car didn't move backward an inch. It was as if an invisible, immovable wall had been erected directly behind their bumper. They were trapped. The road ahead still stretched into the village, a deceptively normal-looking lane flanked by stone cottages. The road behind them had been swallowed by the earth. Forcing down the panic, Leo drove forward, the car creeping into the village of Oakhaven. It was a picture of rustic tranquility. Smoke curled from a few chimneys, and well-tended gardens bloomed with late summer flowers. But the silence was profound. No. Children played in the lanes. No one tended the gardens they passed. The cottages, though neat, had a closed-up, secretive air, their windows like hooded eyes. They parked in a small gravel square before a building that proclaimed itself the Traveler's Rest, with a sign so faded the words were barely legible. As they got out of the car, the sound of their doors closing echoed with a shocking loudness in the quiet. Leo turned to look back the way they had come. His blood ran cold. The section of road they had just driven on, the part that had been directly in front of their car moments before, was now gone. The forest had advanced, silently and instantly, reclaiming another 20 feet of asphalt. The road now ended just a few yards behind their parked car, a clean, abrupt line between civilization and wilderness. They were not just stranded, they were being sealed in. Desperate for answers, they approached the inn. The door opened before they could knock, revealing a man so gaunt. Pale, he seemed to be made of dust and moonlight. His eyes, a washed-out gray, held a deep, weary resignation. He was the innkeeper, a man named Alistair. He did not seem surprised to see them. He ushered them inside to a common room that smelled of old wood and damp ashes, his movements slow, as if he were moving through water. When Leo, his voice tight with barely controlled alarm, explained what they had witnessed, Alistair merely nodded. "The roads remember," he said, his voice a dry rustle. "They remember when this place was whole, and they resent the intrusion. They are taking back what was theirs." He explained that Oakhaven was a place cut off, not just in space but in time. The vanishing roads were a symptom, a protective barrier that ensured no one came in, and more importantly, that no one who stumbled in could ever leave. The villagers, he said, were the descendants of those who had been trapped generations ago. They had learned to live with their isolation, turning inward, becoming as reclusive and quiet as the land that held them prisoner. The couple's hope, so vibrant and full just an hour ago, curdled into a hard, cold lump of fear. They were trapped in a beautiful open-air prison, its walls made of disappearing tarmac and advancing forest. The reclusive locals, with their timeless, weary eyes, were not neighbors, they were fellow inmates. As dusk began to bleed the color from the sky, Leo and Mia felt the invisible bars of their cage settle into place. The investigation into this impossible phenomenon was no longer a matter of curiosity. It was a desperate fight for their future, a race against the silently, inexorably disappearing world. The innkeeper's words hung in the dusty air of the common room, a sentence of perpetual isolation. Leo and Mia sat in stunned silence, the weight of their entrapment pressing down on them, as tangible as the stone walls of the inn. The reclusive villagers were not hostile, but their resignation was a more terrifying prison than any lock and key. They had accepted their fate, becoming custodians of their own cage. Leo and Mia, with the fresh memory of an open world still bright in their minds, could not. Driven by a desperation that sharpened their wits, they spent the evening not in despair, but in determined research. Alistair, perhaps moved by the raw hope in their eyes, provided them with access to the village's sole archive, a chest of worm-eaten documents kept in a back room. By the flickering light of a single oil lamp, they sifted through brittle papers and faded maps. The story they pieced together was one of ancient conflict, not between men, but between man and the land itself. Centuries ago, the founders of Oakhaven had clear-cut a sacred grove to build their village, breaking a pact with the old spirits of the forest. In retaliation, the woods had laid a curse upon the settlement, a spell of severance designed to protect the remaining wild places. The enchantment caused the roads to retreat, folding the village in upon itself, a punishment for its intrusion. It was not malice, but a deep, magical immune response. The key to breaking it, according to a fragment of parchment written in a frantic, archaic script, was not to fight the forest, but to appease it. The curse was a living thing, woven from the land's memory of the wrong done to it. To mend the roads, they had to mend the relationship. Document described a cleansing ritual, a simple act of acknowledgement and apology to be performed at the village's heart, the old stone cross in the central square, which stood on the very ground where the sacred grove's heart tree had once grown. Dawn found them in the square, the pale light doing little to soften the grim faces of the few villagers who had gathered, drawn by the rumor of the outsiders' audacious plan. They watched with a mixture of skepticism and a faint, fragile hope they dared not name. In the center of the square stood the weathered stone cross, its surface grooved by centuries of rain and wind. At its base, Leo and Mia had arranged the simple components of the ritual: a basin of water drawn from the village's ancient, unconsecrated well, a bundle of herbs gathered from the forest's edge, not from the deep woods, as a sign of respect, and a smooth, dark stone from the dry riverbed. There were no incantations from a book, no grand gestures. Following the spirit of the instructions, not the letter, Mia poured the clear, cold water over the base of the cross, a libation for the parched earth. Leo scattered the herbs, their sharp, clean scent a pledge of peace. Then together they placed the river stone at the foot of the cross, a symbol of the enduring, unyielding heart of the land they had wronged. They did not speak to a god or a ghost, but to the village itself, to the memory in the soil and the ancient awareness in the trees. They offered a silent, heartfelt apology, not for themselves, but for the long-ago axes that had felled the grove. They acknowledged the sacrilege and asked humbly for the roads to be restored, for the isolation to end. For a long, tense moment, nothing happened. The villagers began to shift, their fragile hope flickering out, replaced by the familiar resignation. Then a subtle vibration began in the soles of their feet, a deep, resonant hum that rose up from the earth itself. The stone cross seemed to shimmer, not with light, but with a sudden, profound solidity. From the edge of the square, a sound like a great, slow inhalation whispered through the air. They all turned to look. The wall of trees at the end of the lane, the one that had so abruptly terminated the road behind their car, was receding. It was not a physical movement of trunks and branches, but a rewinding of reality itself. The ancient oaks and tangled undergrowth blurred, dissolving like a mirage, and in their place, the sun-warmed gray of the asphalt unspooled, smooth and seamless, stretching back through the valley the way they had come. The forest was pulling back, relinquishing its claim, its protective enchantment dissolving in the face of the long-awaited apology. A collective gasp, part shock, part disbelieving joy, rippled through the small crowd. A woman brought her hands to her mouth, tears welling in her eyes. A man reached out tentatively, as if to touch the returned road, to assure himself it was real. The profound, suffocating silence that had gripped Oakhaven for generations was broken by the sound of the wind in the leaves that remained at a respectful distance, and the distant, forgotten call of a bird. Leo and Mia did not stay for the celebrations that were slowly, hesitantly beginning to bloom. Their work was done. They got into their car, the vehicle now parked on a road that led somewhere, to a world that was once again connected. As they drove away, the village of Oakhaven receding in the rearview mirror, they did not see a place of eerie mystery, but a community. Tentatively stepping out of the shadows, they drove in a reflective silence, the hum of the tires on the solid, unchanging road, a novel and beautiful music. The experience settled deep within them, a profound lesson on the price of isolation and the invisible bonds of community, both the one they had left behind and the one they had just helped to set free. The true journey had not been the miles on the map, but the understanding that some walls are built not of stone, but of forgotten words, and that the key to any prison often lies not in escape, but in reconciliation. The first lantern appeared just as the last sliver of sun drowned itself in the western hills, a single, golden eye kindling in the deep blue twilight of the lower pasture. Farmer John saw it from his kitchen window, his hand pausing on the pump handle as he filled the kettle for his evening tea. It was too early for any of the village children to be out with lights, and too far from the lane for a lost hiker. He watched, his forehead creased, as the lantern began to move. It did not swing or bob with the gait of a carrier. It glided, a steady, serene sphere of light floating a few feet above the tall, uncut grass, tracing a path that no human foot would logically take, straight through the thickest part of the field toward the old woods. He dismissed it as a trick of the deepening dark, a will-o'-the-wisp born of swamp gas and an overactive imagination. But then a second light bloomed further down the slope, and a third, until a loose, silent procession of a dozen lanterns was weaving through his fields, their flames unwavering in the still night air. They moved with a collective, unhurried purpose, a funeral march without mourners, a parade without sound. There were no figures holding them, no dark shapes outlined against the golden glow. The lanterns were simply there, carriers of their own silent, luminous intent, drifting through the land he plowed and planted as if he, and his fences, and his claims of ownership were utterly irrelevant. A deep, primal unease stirred in John's chest, the same feeling he got when he found a stone circle in a newly broken field or turned up a flint arrowhead with the plow. This was an older business than his deeds and titles. Setting his cold tea aside, he pulled on his heavy coat and took his own storm lantern from its hook by the door. Its light was a harsh yellow splash compared to the soft, ethereal gold of the procession, a clumsy human intrusion into the spectral pageant. He stepped out into the chill air and crossed the yard, his boots crunching on the gravel. He unlatched the gate to the lower pasture and stepped into the dewy grass. The procession was ahead of him, the lanterns like a string of low-hanging, earth-bound stars drifting toward the dark line of Hunter's Wood. He followed, keeping a respectful distance, his own light held low. The floating lanterns paid him no mind. They continued their silent, stately progress. their light casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to have a life of their own. They moved through a dip in the land where a stream ran, and John saw their light reflected not in the water, but in the air just above it, a double procession marching on an invisible plain. They entered the woods, and John, his heart thudding a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs, followed. The canopy closed overhead, swallowing the starlight, and the world narrowed to the path of golden light and the circle of his own feeble lamp. The lanterns wove through the ancient trees with an unerring sense of direction, their glow illuminating gnarled roots and patches of phosphorescent moss. The air grew colder, carrying the scent of damp earth and decay, a church-like solemnity settling over the forest. He had hunted these woods all his life, knew every badger set and fox run, but he was walking a path he had never seen, a trail that seemed to exist only for this nightly pilgrimage, after what felt like an hour. The trees thinned, opening into a small, circular clearing he had never encountered. In the center stood a ring of moss-covered standing stones, slumped and weary with age, their surfaces scarred with weather and faint, indecipherable carrings. The lanterns drifted into the clearing and began to circle the stones, their slow, orbital dance a silent, ritualistic veneration. Then, one by one, they winked out. Not extinguished, but simply ceasing to be, their light dissolving into the darkness until the clearing was left in profound blackness, save for the trembling yellow pool from John's own lamp. He stood at the edge of the clearing, the silence now absolute and heavy. This was no random haunting. This was a destination, an ancient burial site, a place of the old people, long before his family had ever laid claim to these fields. The lanterns were not lost, they were going home. And they were leading the lost with them. The weight of the discovery settled upon him, not as fear, but as a solemn responsibility. He had witnessed a secret, a piece of the land's hidden heartbeat, and he knew, with the certainty of a man who understands soil and seasons, that he had to know its story. He turned and made his way back through the dark woods. The memory of the silent, golden procession burned into his mind, a mystery rooted deeper than any crop he would ever grow. The silent, golden procession through his fields and into the heart of Hunter's Wood was no longer a mystery to be feared, but a truth to be understood. John spent the next day not in the familiar rhythms of the farm, but in the hushed, paper-scented quiet of the village archive, a small room above the post office that smelled of beeswax and forgotten years. He was a man of the soil, his hands more accustomed to the rough texture of a plow handle than the brittle fragility of old parchment, but he worked with a farmer's patience, sifting through parish records, land deeds, and the spidery handwriting of long-dead vicars. He found the story not in a single document, but woven through the margins of history, a faint, golden thread in the drab tapestry of official records. The standing stones in the clearing were indeed a burial site, but not for kings or chieftains. They were a communal grave, a final resting place for the victims of a forgotten plague that had swept the valley centuries ago, a sickness so swift and terrible that the dead had been gathered and interred in a single, sorrowful night. Local folklore recorded in a curate's diary spoke of the Lantern Walk, a belief that the souls of those who died without peace, without the proper rites or the comfort of their families, could not find their way to the afterlife. They were trapped, wandering the land of their lives, guided only by the memory of light. The lantern processions were not a haunting, but a pilgrimage. The lights were not carried by spirits, they were the spirits, or rather the vessels for their yearning. Their condensed essence seeking the ancient, sacred ground where they could finally be released from their restless wandering. They were not malevolent, but profoundly lost, and the nightly procession was their eternal, silent plea for a guide to their own graves. The revelation transformed the eerie spectacle into a profound tragedy. John thought of the lonely, golden lights drifting through his fields, not as trespassers, but as mourners at their own endless funeral. They were not seeking to disturb the living, they were seeking peace, and he, the current steward of this land, had witnessed their sorrow. A sense of duty, deeper than any deed or boundary, settled upon him. He could not lay the plague victims to rest, but he could offer them an acknowledgement, a gesture of remembrance that might help still their restless journey. That evening, as twilight began to bleed the color from the sky, John did not wait at his window. He went to his barn and took down a simple, unlit lantern. From a dusty beam, one he had not used in years. He cleaned its glass until it shone, filled it with fresh oil, and fixed a new wick. This was not to be a light of curiosity or fear, but one of honor. He carried it out to the edge of the lower pasture, to the place where he had first seen the procession, and he waited. The first golden light appeared right on schedule, kindling in the deep blue of the field. Then another and another, until the silent parade was once more gliding toward the woods. As the procession drew near, John lifted his own lantern. He did not light it with a match. He simply held it, his intention a clear, silent signal in the gathering dark. The lead lantern of the procession seemed to hesitate, its glow pulsing softly. Then it drifted toward him, not with threat, but with a gentle, questioning grace. It came to a stop a few feet away, and as it did, the wick of John's own lantern burst into flame with a soft whoosh, not with the yellow glare of kerosene, but with the same soft, ethereal gold as the spectral lights. The flame was cool to the touch, a light of spirit, not of substance. His heart swelled with a feeling that was neither fear nor triumph, but a deep, resonant connection. He had not intruded, he had been invited. He turned and, holding his newly lit lantern aloft, joined the procession. He walked among them, his booted footsteps the only sound in the silent, solemn march. The golden lights floated around him, their presence no longer eerie, but companionable, a fellowship of the lost and the witness. They moved together through the fields and into the woods, retracing the path to the stone circle. In the clearing, the lanterns began their slow, orbital dance around the mossy stones. John walked to the center of the circle and placed his lantern gently on the flat, altar-like stone at its heart. He did not speak aloud, but in his mind, he offered a simple, heartfelt thought, a memorial for the ancestors of this land, for the lives cut short and the peace long denied. He thought of his own family, generations of farmers buried in the churchyard, their rest earned and honored. He offered that same sense of rest to these older, forgotten souls. As his silent prayer ended, the lanterns of the procession, one by one, began to rise. They lifted from the ground, floating upward like embers from a dying fire, their golden light intensifying as they ascended. They rose through the branches of the encircling trees, higher and higher, until they merged with the sharp, cold pinpricks of the stars and were gone. The clearing was left in darkness, save for the single golden flame of John's lantern, which sat peacefully upon the central stone. He stood for a long time in the profound silence, a silence that was no longer lonely but full and complete. Then the flame of his lantern gently flickered and went out, its purpose served. He picked up the now cool metal and glass and walked back through the quiet woods, the path feeling familiar and safe. The next night and every night after, John watched from his window. The fields remained dark, the processions had stopped, the lost had finally been found, their endless journey complete. A deep, abiding peace settled over the farm, a peace that seemed to emanate from the very soil. John felt it as he worked the land, a sense of harmony that had been absent before. He had not banished a ghost, he had laid one to rest. In the simple act of adding a lantern in memory of his own ancestors, he had forged a connection between the past and the present, between the living and the dead. He understood now that the cycle of life and death was not a line, but a circle, and that remembrance was the thread that kept it whole. The land felt lighter, and so did he, forever bound to the quiet history he had helped at last to put to bed. The bells began as a vibration in the air, a deep, sonorous hum that seemed to originate not from a single point, but from the very stones beneath Emily's feet. She had come to the edge of the village where the cobbled lane dissolved into a rough track, leading to the skeletal remains of St. Cuthbert's Abbey. The ruins stood stark against a sky the color of bruised slate, their broken arches and tumble-down walls like the ribcage of some long-dead leviathan. There were no bell towers left standing, no ropes, no metal of any kind that could produce such a sound. Yet the bells tolled, a slow, mournful cadence that rolled across the overgrown fields and echoed in the hollows of the ruins, a phantom peal for a congregation of ghosts. It was a sound that should not exist, a physical impossibility that hooked into some deep, primal part of her brain. The villagers had warned her away from the place with nervous glances and muttered excuses about unstable masonry, but their fear had been a palpable thing, a scent on the air. It was that fear, more than any historical curiosity, that drew her now. The bells were. Question, and the Abbey's silence was an answer she felt compelled to hear. She stepped through the gap where the great western gate had once stood, the air growing instantly colder, the damp chill of centuries seeping through her coat. The bells grew louder, the sound no longer a distant echo, but a tangible presence that vibrated in her teeth and bones. It was a call to vespers for a monastery that had been dust for 500 years. Nettles and ivy choked the outlines of cloisters and chapter houses, and the flagstones were cracked and heaved by the roots of stubborn oaks. She walked slowly, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet of moss and last year's leaves, the phantom peals guiding her deeper into the heart of the ruin. A profound sense of presence settled around her, a feeling of being watched not by eyes, but by a collective, timeless attention. It was not hostile, but it was heavy, a weight of centuries of silence now broken by this impossible ringing. She ran her fingers over a section of wall that was less weathered than the rest, its surface etched with faint Latin inscriptions. She brushed away the lichen, the stone cold and rough under her fingertips. The words spoke of vigilance, of a sacred duty. Another fragment, part of a larger plaque now shattered, named brothers who had fallen in defense of the faith's most solemn secret. They were not martyrs to a public cause, but guardians of something hidden, their deaths a final, desperate act of protection. The bells, she realized with a cold thrill of understanding, were not a call to prayer, but an alarm, a warning that had been ringing, unheard for half a millennium. As she moved toward the foundation of what must have been the church's altar, the bells tolling shifted. The mournful, rhythmic peals sharpened, growing faster, more insistent. The deep hum became a clangor, a frantic metallic beating against the silence. The sound was no longer just around her, it was inside her head. Frantic pounding that mirrored the sudden, rapid rhythm of her own heart. The air grew thick, the temperature dropping sharply. The feeling of being watched intensified into a focused, pressing awareness. She was not just a visitor to this place, she was an intruder. The bells were not just echoing through the ruins, they were ringing for her, a frantic, unnerving alert that she was getting too close to the secret the monks had died to keep. The serene exploration curdled into a sharp, metallic fear. The stones themselves seemed to hold their breath, the phantom bells screaming a warning across the centuries, their message clear: turn back. The frantic, clanging bells were no longer a sound but a physical assault, a storm of phantom noise that vibrated in Emily's teeth and shook the very air in her lungs. The serene curiosity that had drawn her into the ruins was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. This was not a random haunting. The inscriptions, the palpable sense of a vigilant presence, the escalating alarm, it all pointed to a singular, urgent truth. The monks were not merely echoing, they were communicating. Their spirits remained, bound to this broken place by a duty unfulfilled, a secret unprotected, and they were using the only voice left to them to scream a warning. The treasure they had died defending was still here, and her presence had triggered its ancient, spiritual guardians. Driven by an instinct she could not name, Emily moved toward the foundation of the high altar, the epicenter of the psychic storm. The air was so cold it burned her throat, and the bell's peals were a single, sustained shriek of spectral metal. She fell to her knees, her hands scrabbling at the thick moss and creeping ivy that blanketed the ancient stones. Her fingers, numb with cold, tore at the vegetation, searching for a seam, a crack, anything that felt unnatural. The frantic ringing seemed to focus on this very spot, a desperate, concentrated effort to drive her away or perhaps to guide her. Her nails scraped against a line in the stone that was too straight, too perfect to be a natural fracture. It was a hidden join, all but invisible beneath the centuries of organic growth. Using a sharp-edged piece of fallen masonry, she pried at the seam, her muscles straining against the weight of the stone and the oppressive, chilling energy that fought her. With a grating groan that was swallowed by the cacophony of bells, a section of the flooring shifted, revealing not earth but a dark, hollow space beneath. The moment the cavity was exposed, the bells ceased. The silence that followed was more shocking than the noise had been. It was an absolute, profound void, a pressure released so suddenly it left her ears ringing in the vacuum. The biting cold lifted, replaced by the simple, damp chill of the ruins. The feeling of being watched vanished, replaced by a new, waiting stillness. The spirits had fallen silent. They had delivered their message, heart. Hammering, Emily reached into the darkness. Her fingers closed not around damp soil or old bones, but around the cold, hard angles of a metal box. She pulled it out, the object surprisingly heavy for its size. It was a simple, iron-banded chest, scarred by time but still solid, its lock long since rusted away. With trembling hands, she lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of crumbled velvet that had once been rich and deep, lay not gold or jewels, but the true treasure of St. Cuthbert's. It was a collection of exquisitely illuminated manuscripts, their vellum pages glowing with gold leaf and vibrant, mineral-based pigments that defied the centuries. There were delicate silver chalices, a jeweled crucifix, and a stack of gold coins, the abbey's legacy, its sacred and secular wealth, hidden from the king's men and the world. This was what the monks had given their lives to protect. This was the secret that had anchored their souls to this broken ground. Their vow had been one of guardianship, a promise made not just to their God, but to the beauty and knowledge they preserved. She understood then what she had to do. To take the chest would be to desecrate their sacrifice, to prove their final desperate act had been in vain. Their peace, their release from this eternal, echoing vigil, depended on the treasure remaining safe, remaining secret. Her role was not to be its discoverer, but its reconsecrator. Working quickly, her breath pluming in the quiet air, she carefully closed the lid. She lowered the chest back into its stone hiding place, ensuring it sat securely on the bed of crumbled velvet. Then she began the work of reburial. She replaced the heavy stone slab, pressing it firmly back into its ancient groove. She gathered armfuls of moss and ivy, carefully rearranging the natural camouflage until the seam was once again invisible. The treasure returned to the earth's keeping. It was an act of profound respect, an honoring of a vow made by men long turned to dust. As she patted the last piece of moss into place, a final, soft, single bell note rang out through the ruins. It was not the frantic alarm or the mournful toll, but a clear, pure, resonant chime that hung in the air like a blessing. It was a sound of gratitude, of release. And then true silence descended upon St. Cuthbert's Abbey, a silence that felt deep and clean and right. Emily stood and walked out of the ruins, the weight of the monk's sacrifice settling upon her not as a burden, but as a solemn understanding. She left the treasure where it lay, a legacy hidden in plain sight, its value measured not in gold, but in the blood and faith of those who had died for it. As she reached the edge of the village and looked back at the dark outlines of the abbey against the twilight sky, she contemplated the nature of such a legacy. It was a story that would never be told, a secret that would die with her. The monks had sacrificed their lives for a truth that would remain. Forever buried and in her own small way, by honoring their vow, she had participated in that sacrifice. It was a legacy of silence, of duty, of a promise kept across the chasm of centuries. And in that silent, steadfast keeping, she found a strange and powerful peace. The village square was a bowl of pre-dawn silence, filled to the brim with a low, clinging fog that muffled the world in woolly gray. David, an early riser by nature and by profession, stood at his cottage door, a steaming mug of tea warming his hands. The air was cold and still, carrying the damp, earthy scent of dew and stone. The familiar outlines of the market cross and the old horse trough were softened, rendered spectral by the mist. It was in this liminal hour, caught between night and day, that the square began to stir with a life that was not of the living. At first he thought it was a trick of the light, the fog coiling into shapes that suggested human form, but the shapes persisted. They solidified from the vapor, becoming a procession of misty figures, their edges blurred and indistinct, their substance the color of faded memory. They drifted through the square with a slow, aimless grace, their movements silent and devoid of purpose. There were dozens of them, men, women, and even the faint, smaller shapes of children, all woven from the same ethereal fabric of the fog itself. They did not walk on the cobbles, but seemed to float just above them, their passage leaving no impression on the wet stone. Profound, unsettling quiet accompanied them, a hush deeper than the natural silence of the sleeping village. David's rational mind scrambled for an explanation, a temperature inversion, a collective hallucination born of sleep deprivation, but his instincts, older and wiser, knew better. He was witnessing something that defied the neat categories of his world. Setting his mug down on the step, he stepped out into the square, the cold damp of the fog immediately seeping through his clothes. He moved toward the nearest figure, a tall, indistinct form that seemed to be a man. He raised a hand, not in fear, but in a tentative gesture of greeting. "Hello," he whispered, the words swallowed by the muffling fog. The figure did not turn. It continued its slow, meandering path, its back to him. David quickened his pace, coming around to face it. The features were a smooth, blank oval, the face of the mist itself. He reached out, his fingers stretching to brush against the figure's arm. There was no contact. His hand passed through the form as if through cold smoke. A jolt of icy sensation, not wetness but a profound spatial cold, shot up his arm. The figure shuddered, its form rippling like the surface of a pond disturbed by a stone. For a single, heart-stopping second, the blank oval of its face seemed to focus, two dark, empty pits turning toward him. Then, with a soundless sigh, the figure dissolved. It didn't vanish, but simply unraveled, its misty substance dispersing back into the general fog from which it had come. All around him, the other figures began to do the same, fading away like breath on a cold windowpane until the square was empty once more, leaving only the silent, gray dawn and the pounding of his own heart. As the sun finally breached the horizon, its weak, golden light beginning to burn away the fog, the village began to wake. Shutters were opened, and the scent of baking bread began to mix with the damp air. David, shaken to his core, sought out the villagers, the ones whose families had lived here for generations. He found them in the post office and the small grocery, their faces at first closed and wary when he mentioned the figures in the square. But seeing the raw, earnest need for understanding in his eyes, their reserve softened. Over a pint in the quiet pub that evening, an old man named Reese, his hands gnarled like the roots of an oak, shared the story. It was not a ghost story told to frighten children, but a dark, bloody chapter of local history spoken of in hushed tones. Centuries ago, the village had been a site of a brutal massacre. A company of soldiers, lost and desperate during a long-forgotten rebellion, had descended upon the unsuspecting community, accusing them of harboring enemies. In the square at dawn, they had cut down men, women, and children without mercy, their bodies left where they fell. The horror had been so absolute, the injustice so profound, that the memory of it had soaked into the very stones of the square. The misty figures were not random phantoms. They were the victims, condemned to relive their final, terrified moments each dawn, their silent procession a perpetual reenactment of their last, confused walk before the blades fell. The story settled upon David with the weight of a tombstone. The aimless wandering, the blank faces, the way they faded at a touch, it was all a reflection of that sudden, brutal, and bewildering end. They were not haunting the village. They were trapped in a memory, a collective, psychic wound that played out in the fog every morning. The compulsion that now burned within him was fiercer than any fear. He could not simply witness this tragedy and walk away. He had to uncover the full, unvarnished truth behind the apparitions, to find a way to speak for those who had been so violently silenced. The misty figures were a question written in fog and sorrow, and he felt, with a certainty that was both terrifying and exhilarating, that he was the one destined to find the answer. The The story of the massacre was a stain that would not wash out, a truth so dark and heavy it seemed to pull the very light from the air. David carried it with him through the day, the image of the misty figures now overlaid with the horrific clarity of Reese's words. The aimless drift through the square was not random. It was the final, terrified milling of a community moments from annihilation. The blank faces were not a lack of identity, but the obliteration of it, the shock of a violence so sudden it erased the self before it took the life. They were not ghosts in the traditional sense. They were an echo of trauma, a psychic scar on the village that wept ethereal blood every dawn. He spent the day in the village's small library, a room that smelled of old glue and yellowed paper, poring over the few surviving records from that brutal period. The official histories were sanitized, speaking of unrest and regrettable incidents, but in a privately printed local chronicle, he found the raw, unvarnished account. It listed names: farmers, blacksmiths, weavers, children, all cut down. It described the square running red, the silence that fell afterward broken only by the cawing of crows. The final, heartbreaking detail was that the bodies had been buried in a mass, unmarked graves somewhere on the outskirts of the village, denied individual rights or remembrance. Their spirits were not just trapped by the violence of their death, but by the profound injustice of their oblivion. They were unable to move on because they had never been laid to rest, they had been discarded. The solution, when it came to him, was not an exorcism or a complex ritual. It was something simpler, more human. They did not need to be banished, they needed to be seen. They needed the memorial service they had been denied for centuries. He would give them a funeral. He went to the vicar, a young, pragmatic man initially skeptical of local superstitions, but the conviction in David's eyes and the grim weight of the historical evidence moved him. David then spoke to the villagers, not with the excitement of a ghost hunter, but with the solemnity of a bearer of bad news. He spoke of the names he had read, of the families that might have been their own ancestors, of the debt owed by the living to the dead. To his surprise, he found not resistance, but a quiet, shame-faced acceptance. The story was a secret they had all known, a shadow they had chosen to ignore. David's purpose gave them a way to finally face it. The next dawn, the entire village gathered at the edge of the square, wrapped in coats against the chill, their breath pluming in the gray air. They did not speak. The vicar stood beside David, a simple wooden cross in his hands. As the first fingers of light touched the eastern hills, the mist began to coalesce. The figures appeared, their forms weaving out of the fog as they always did, beginning their silent, sorrowful procession. But this time they were not alone. As the misty forms drifted, the vicar began to speak. His voice, clear and steady, cut through the oppressive silence. He did not use complex liturgy. He spoke of loss, of innocence destroyed, of a community shattered. He spoke the names David had found in the chronicle, one by one, giving identity back to the anonymous shades. With each name, a corresponding figure in the mist would seem to slow, its form becoming momentarily more distinct, as if listening, the villagers bowed their heads, a collective, silent apology spanning the centuries. David had arranged for a single, clear bell to be brought from the church. As the last name was spoken, a young girl, a descendant of one of the families on the list, stepped forward and struck it. The note was pure and clean, a resonant chime that rolled across the square, a sound of peace and finality after the long silence of violence. As the bell's echo faded, a profound change came over the misty figures. Their aimless wandering ceased. They stopped, turning as one to face the gathered living. Their blank, featureless faces seemed to soften. Then, as the first true ray of sunlight broke over the rooftops and touched the square, the figures did not fade as they usually did. They brightened. Their misty forms dissolved not into nothingness, but into light, a soft, golden luminescence that lifted gently upward, like embers from a dying fire, before dissipating into the brightening sky. The square was left empty, the fog burning away under the honest light of the new day. The air, once heavy with sorrow, felt light and clean. The villagers dispersed quietly, a shared, unspoken catharsis passing between them. David stood alone in the now sun-shadowed square. He reflected on the nature of the justice he had helped deliver. It was not the justice of courts or vengeance, but the deeper, more fundamental justice of remembrance. To be forgotten was the final, cruelest cut. By speaking their names, by acknowledging their pain, he had given the victims the only thing that could truly free them, the assurance that their lives and their deaths had mattered. The misty figures were gone, not banished, but finally at peace, their long vigil over, their story heard. As the sun warmed the ancient cobbles, David understood that some ghosts are not chains to the past, but unanswered questions, and that the truest form of justice is sometimes simply a matter of bearing witness. Earth itself was trying to speak, and its language was one of terror. Anna saw it from the ridge above the village, a patchwork of fields laid out like a frantic green page, but the text was not written in orderly rows of wheat or barley. It was scrawled in the crops themselves, a chaotic, sprawling script of blighted stalks and unnaturally vibrant leaves that formed letters, words, warnings. From this height, the message was chillingly clear. A vast, jagged leaf was carved into a field of oats, the letters a sickly yellow against the healthy green. Further on, in a patch of root vegetables, the word danger spiraled out in a livid purple, the turnips and beets themselves twisted into the shapes of the runes. The very land was screaming a silent botanical alarm. Anna, an agriculturist whose life was a dialogue with the soil, felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. This was no fungal blight or mineral deficiency. This was intentional. The patterns were too precise, the messages too coherent. She descended the ridge, the sweet, normal scent of clover and damp earth giving way to a strange metallic tang that hung over the afflicted fields. The village of Oakhaven, a different Oakhaven from the one with the disappearing roads, lay quiet below, its stone cottages huddled together as if for protection. But it was the fields the villagers were avoiding. She saw a woman hanging washing, her back resolutely turned to the sprawling run that was emerging in the cabbages behind her garden wall. A man mending a fence deliberately kept his eyes on his work, not glancing at the barley that spelled fear just beyond his property line. The air was thick with a fear as palpable as the strange scent from the crops. Her first stop was the farmstead at the edge of the cursed land. The farmer, a man named Gareth with hands like gnarled oak and eyes shadowed by sleepless nights, met her at his gate. He didn't offer a greeting, only a grim nod toward his fields. It started. "Small," he said, his voice a low rasp. A few stalks out of place, then words, "Go, beware, now, this." He gestured helplessly at the sprawling, vegetative plea for help. He refused to set foot in the fields anymore. Neither would anyone else. The harvest was rotting on the stalk, but the risk of encountering whatever was writing these messages was deemed far greater than the loss of the food. The village was living on dwindling stores and a deep, superstitious dread. Anna, armed with her kit of soil probes and specimen jars, was the only one willing to walk into the text. The moment she stepped between the rows of spelled-out oats, the air changed. It grew colder and the metallic tang intensified, coating the back of her throat. The plants themselves felt wrong. The stalks of the L and leaf were brittle, snapping at a touch, while the leaves of the E were unnaturally supple and warm, pulsing with a faint, sick energy. She took samples, soil from the root zones of the blighted letters, leaves from the two vibrant ones. She mapped the patterns, noting how the messages always faced the village, never the wild hills beyond. This was a communication directed squarely at the residents. In the village's lone pub that evening, the air was thick with more than just smoke. The locals spoke in hushed tones, their conversations trailing off when she approached. But with patience and a sympathetic ear, the older patrons began to share the stories they'd heard from their grandparents. They spoke of Alara, the willow witch, a woman who had lived in the hills generations ago. She was a healer, a keeper of the old ways who knew the secrets of the plants. The village had turned on her, accusing her of blighting a harvest when a new, zealous preacher arrived. They drove her out, burning her cottage. As the flames consumed her home, she was said to have laid a curse upon the fields, vowing that the land would never again bear fruit in peace, and that it would one day speak with her voice, spelling out the truth they had refused to hear. Anna listened, the legend weaving itself around the scientific data in her mind. A curse. It was an unscientific, irrational concept, and yet it was the only framework that fit the evidence. The soil samples, when she tested them later by lamplight in her rented room, showed no known toxins, no abnormal pH levels. They were, by all accounts, perfectly healthy, and yet they were producing these frantic, impossible patterns. It was as if the very intention of the curse had been imprinted upon the earth, a psychic poison that bypassed all physical laws. The witch's voice, silenced by fire and fear, was now screaming back at the village through the one medium she had always understood, the growing things. Anna knew then that her investigation would have to delve deeper than soil composition. She would have to unearth the full, bitter truth behind Alara's story, for the key to silencing the crops desperate. Warnings lay not in a laboratory, but in the dark, tangled roots of the village's own haunted past. The legend of Alara, the Willow Witch, was no longer a fireside tale, but a key that fit the lock of the cursed fields. Anna's scientific mind, trained to follow evidence, now followed the trail of sorrow and injustice. The soil was healthy, the seeds were pure, yet the crops grew in patterns of terror. The only variable was memory, the land's own bitter memory of a woman wronged. Heal the fields, she would have to heal the story. Her research led her from the hushed pub to the village's oldest resident, a woman named Morwenna who lived in a cottage clinging to the hillside, its garden a defiant riot of color against the gray stone. Morwenna's eyes, the color of faded violets, held a deep ancestral knowledge. She did not seem surprised by Anna's questions. She was, she revealed, a direct descendant of Alara's sister, the only branch of the family that had not fled or died out. From a locked chest, she produced a bundle of letters, their ink faded to a ghostly brown. They were Alara's, written before the persecution, filled with gentle wisdom about herb lore and a profound love for the land. The final letter was unfinished, its last sentence trailing into a blot of ink, as if the writer had been interrupted by the mob at her door. The words were not of anger, but of a heartbreaking bewilderment. Why do they fear the green things that sustain them? It read, "The earth gives only what we sow." This was the truth the curse was trying to communicate. It was not a scream of vengeance, but a cry of grief. Alara had not cursed the land to punish it. She had bound her own sorrow and betrayal to it, a psychic stain that manifested as the village's deepest fears. The crops spelled leave and danger not as a threat from the witch, but as the village's own guilty conscience projected onto the soil, the land holding up a mirror to their ancestral sin, to lift the curse. And apology was not enough. A debt, centuries old, needed to be paid. Anna understood her role. She was to be the intermediary, the one who could translate the language of the land back into the language of people. With Morwenna's blessing, she devised a ritual of amends, not of magic, but of meaningful action. She did not seek to break the curse, but to fulfill its purpose, to have the truth acknowledged and honor restored. At dawn, with the entire village watching from a fearful distance, Anna and Morwenna walked into the center of the largest cursed field, the one that spelled fear in twisted barley. They did not bring potions or charms. Instead, they carried a young willow sapling, grown from a cutting from a tree that had once shaded Alara's cottage. They also brought the bundle of letters. As the sun rose, its light pale and hesitant on the blighted stalks, Morwenna read the final, unfinished letter aloud, her old voice steady, giving Alara's words the voice they had been denied. She spoke of the love for the land, the pain of betrayal, and the hope for understanding. Then Anna knelt. With her bare hands, she dug into the cold, cursed earth at the very center of the field. The soil, which had felt so hostile before, now seemed to soften under her touch, as if listening. She planted the willow sapling, tucking the bundle of letters gently amongst its roots, a symbolic return of Alara's spirit to the land she loved. It was not an exorcism, but a homecoming. As she patted the soil firm around the slender trunk, she offered a silent, heartfelt apology on behalf of the village, an acknowledgement of the wrong and a plea for release. For a long moment, nothing happened. The cold, metallic air hung heavy. Then a gentle breeze stirred, smelling not of ozone and fear, but of damp earth and growing things. It whispered through the field, and as it passed, a visible change flowed through the crops. The jagged, yellowed letters of fear began to soften. The stalks straightened, their sickly color deepening to a healthy gold. The twisted, purple runes of danger in the neighboring field relaxed, the vegetables beneath swelling into their proper, robust shapes. It was as if an invisible hand was smoothing out a wrinkle in reality, rewriting the frantic script back into the peaceful prose of a healthy harvest. The curse was not breaking, it was being answered. The land, having finally been heard, was letting go of its grief. Within an hour, the fields of Oakhaven were just fields again. The warnings were gone, replaced by the uniform, vibrant green of thriving crops. The unnatural chill and the metallic tang vanished, replaced by the wholesome scent of loam and chlorophyll. A collective sigh seemed to rise from the villagers, a release of a tension that had gripped them for generations. They slowly, hesitantly stepped out of their gardens and onto the footpaths, their faces filled with a wonder that slowly bloomed into a profound, tearful relief. Anna stayed just long enough to see the first signs of the village's renewal. Gareth was the first to walk into his field, running his hands through the now healthy oats with a disbelieving laugh. The community, united by their shared deliverance, began to plan for a harvest festival, the first in many years. The lesson was etched into the very soil they stood on. She departed as the afternoon sun gilded the fields, the new willow sapling a small, hopeful promise in the center of the vast, green expanse. As she drove away, she reflected on the themes woven through her strange journey. It was a story of forgiveness, not in the sense of pardoning a wrong, but in the deeper sense of understanding its root and tending to the wound it left behind. And it was a story of harmony, a reminder that humanity is not separate from nature, but a part of it. Our actions, our injustices, and our amends are all sown into the land, and the harvest we reap is always a reflection of what we have planted, not just in the earth, but in the silent, waiting memory of the world itself. The crops were no longer cursed because the story had, at last, found its peaceful end. The past was not a locked room for Mr. Gray. It was a house with paper-thin walls, and in this village, the walls were tearing. He had come to the nameless hamlet nestled in a fold of the chalk hills seeking respite, a quiet place to organize his notes on medieval land grants. But the moment his car crested the final rise and the village lay spread out below him in the late afternoon sun, he felt it, a subtle spatial disorientation, as if the air itself was layered, like the translucent pages of an old book. The first slip happened as he stepped out of the car, his leather-soled shoes meeting the gravel of the pub car park. For a single, dizzying second, the gravel was not there. His foot met soft, churned earth, and the scent of wood smoke and roasting meat was replaced by the acrid tang of a blacksmith's forge. The red brick of the pub wall flickered, replaced by the rough-hewn timber and daub of a longhouse. A man in a coarse homespun tunic walked directly through the space where his car's bonnet should have been, his face grimed with soot, his gaze passing through gray as if he were morning mist. Then the world snapped back with a gut-lurching finality. Gravel crunched under his feet. The pub stood solid and real. The air smelled of cut grass and exhaust fumes. Gray leaned against his car, his heart hammering, the historian in him thrilled and terrified in equal measure. He had not just studied history, he had just stood in it. He took a room at the pub, his hands trembling slightly as he filled out the register. The innkeeper, a woman with a calm, timeless face, watched him with an unnerving stillness. When he mentioned the disorientation, she merely nodded slowly. "The village dreams," she said, her voice soft, "and sometimes it dreams aloud." "You have the look of a good listener, mister." Gray, some hear the whispers, you seem to see them. She offered no further explanation, only a key and a quiet warning to be mindful of the shadows at noon and dusk when the walls were thinnest. Driven by a feverish curiosity, Gray spent the next day walking the lanes, his notebook in hand, his senses stretched to their limit. The slips were not constant, but they were frequent, unpredictable lurches through time. He would be looking at a neat, modern cottage with a satellite dish, and then in a blink it would be a wattle and daub hovel, its roof thick with moss, a scrawny chicken pecking at the dirt where a paved driveway would one day be. He witnessed a moment from the Civil War, seeing a group of dour-faced Roundheads marching down the high street, their pikes glinting in a sun that was, for that moment, the same sun that shone on him. He saw Victorian children in stiff, formal clothes playing with a hoop on the village green, their laughter, a ghostly echo overlapping with the caw of a present-day crow. He saw a Saxon farmer guiding a heavy plow drawn by oxen through a field that was now a manicured lawn. The experiences were not visual alone, they were multisensory. The smells changed: wood smoke, unwashed bodies, the sweet scent of hay. The sounds shifted: the clang of a hammer on iron, the lowing of cattle, the crackle of a hearth fire. He felt the chill of a medieval winter and the damp heat of a Tudor summer. The disorientation was profound, a constant seasickness of the soul. His own timeline felt fragile, his place in the world less certain. He found himself checking his watch compulsively, anchoring himself to the present with the mundane facts of his digital watch, a tiny, blinking shield against the vast, swirling ocean of the past. He was a historian adrift in the very current he had spent his life charting from the safe shore of documents and artifacts. Here the artifacts were alive, the documents were written in air and light, and he was no longer an observer, but a participant in a collapsing chronology. He had come to study a static past, and instead found himself trapped in a river of time that had overflowed its banks, its turbulent waters churning with the silt of centuries. His research was no longer about land grants. It was a desperate, personal quest to find the source of the rupture, to understand the pattern in the chaos before the relentless tide of yesterday washed his own today completely away. The time slips were no longer isolated incidents. They were a fever in the village's veins, and Mr. Gray was burning up with it. His notes, once orderly columns of dates and facts, had devolved into a frantic spiderweb scrawl of overlapping timelines, a desperate cartography of chaos. He had witnessed a Norman knight receiving his feudal dues in the churchyard, while a modern dog-walker tossed a ball for her spaniel through the knight's spectral horse. He had smelled the pungent odor of a tannery from the 1600s while standing outside the village's pristine bakery. The past was not whispering, it was shouting, a cacophony of eras all vying for dominance in the same physical space. His own sense of self felt frayed, his identity a bookmark threatened by a gale in the library of time. His research into temporal anomalies, once an academic abstraction, became a lifeline. He pored over his own books and the few esoteric texts in the village's small lending library, searching for a pattern, a cause. Key, he began to suspect, was not a place, but a mechanism. The slips were not random, they were rhythmic, pulsing with a regularity that suggested a source, a damaged engine at the heart of the village's chronology. His conversations with the few villagers who would speak to him, mostly the very old, who seemed to accept the strangeness as one accepts bad weather, yielded a common thread. The anomalies had grown worse, they said, in the last few decades, and they all invariably mentioned the tower. The tower stood at the village crossroads, a squat square structure of flint and limestone, its face bare of a clock, its interior silent and sealed for 100 years. Local lore held that the last clockmaker, a reclusive genius named Alaric, had been working on a revolutionary mechanism, a device he claimed could measure the weight of a moment. The official story was that he had died, his work unfinished. But the older, darker whispers suggested his experiment had not failed, but had succeeded catastrophically, unleashing the very temporal instability that now plagued the village. The clock tower wasn't just dormant, it was the wound, the epicenter of the temporal quakes. On a day when the air itself seemed to buzz with latent history, Gray approached the tower. The oak door was thick with grime, its iron lock rusted shut. Using a crowbar he'd borrowed from the pub's innkeeper, who had handed it over with a look of grim fatalism, he pried at the aged wood. With a groan of protesting timber and metal, the lock gave way, and the door swung inward on darkness and the smell of dust and old oil. Inside, the tower was a single, cylindrical chamber, dominated by the colossal, intricate skeleton of Alaric's unfinished masterpiece. Gears the size of cartwheels, pendulums of polished brass, and a complex web of wires and crystalline lenses filled the space, all frozen in a silent metallic scream. But it was not entirely dead. At the heart of the mechanism, a complex array of interlocking silver discs and a central milky crystal pulsed with a faint, sickly light. A low, subaudible hum vibrated through the stone floor, a frequency that set Gray's teeth on edge. This was it, the Chronos engine. Not broken, but damaged, its regulating mechanism shattered, its power leaking out in uncontrolled waves, bleeding time across the village. He saw the problem immediately. A mainspring, a coil of blued steel thicker than his arm, had snapped. The released energy was being chaotically channeled through the crystal core, warping the local flow of time instead of measuring it. The slips were the symptoms of this catastrophic failure. To stabilize time, he wouldn't have to understand the full genius complexity of the device. He would have to perform emergency surgery on it. He would have to repair the spring. It took him the rest of the day and into the night, working by the beam of his electric torch. The air in the tower was thick with temporal static. The past pressed in on him, showing him flickering images of Alaric himself, a gaunt, frantic figure making adjustments, his face alight with a terrifying fervor just before the final, disastrous snap. Gray worked with a historian's reverence and a surgeon's focus, using tools he found in a dusty chest. He painstakingly reset the broken spring, using clamps and his own strength to wind it back to a state of tension, mimicking the design he inferred from the other, intact components. It was an act of profound intuition, a guess across a chasm of centuries. As he tightened the final bolt, the pulsing light from the crystal core steadied. The sickly throb became a calm, rhythmic glow. The subaudible hum softened, transforming from a dissonant rattle into a deep, resonant, and harmonious tone, like the lowest note of a massive bell. The oppressive, shifting pressure in the air vanished. The flickering ghosts of the past, which had been a constant, shimmering backdrop in the tower, solidified into one final, clear image. Alaric, his face no longer frantic but peaceful, his eyes meeting Gray's across the years. He gave a slow, grateful nod and then faded, not like a ghost, but like a finished thought. Gray stumbled out of the tower as the first true dawn in what felt like an eternity began to lighten the sky. The village looked the same, but it felt different. The air was clean, the light was steady, and the world felt solid beneath his feet. The time slips had ceased, the river of time had returned to its banks, flowing in one clear, singular direction. He left the village later that morning, the repaired Chronos engine a secret he would carry with him. He had not just fixed a clock, he had sutured a wound in reality itself. The experience had given him an insight that no amount of book learning ever could. History was not a linear path, but a fluid, living force, and human experience was a fragile vessel upon its surface. The past was not a foreign country, it was the very ground upon which the present was built, and sometimes that ground could shift. He drove away with a new, humbled understanding of the profound and delicate fluidity of it all. The time slips were no longer isolated incidents, they were a fever in the village's veins, and Mr. Gray was burning up with it. His notes, once orderly columns of dates and facts, had devolved into a frantic, spiderweb scrawl of overlapping timelines, a desperate cartography of chaos. He had witnessed a Norman knight receiving his feudal dues in the churchyard, while a modern dog-walker tossed a ball for her spaniel through the night's spectral horse. He had smelled the pungent odor of a tannery from the 1600s while standing outside the village's pristine bakery. The past was not whispering, it was shouting, a cacophony of eras all vying for dominance in the same physical space. His own sense of self felt frayed, his identity a bookmark threatened by a gale in the library of time. His research into temporal anomalies, once an academic abstraction, became a lifeline. He pored over his own books and the few esoteric texts in the village's small lending library, searching for a pattern, a cause. The key, he began to suspect, was not a place but a mechanism. The slips were not random, they were rhythmic, pulsing with a regularity that suggested a source, a damaged engine at the heart of the village's chronology. His conversations with the few villagers who would speak to him, mostly the very old who seemed to accept the strangeness as one accepts bad weather, yielded a common thread. The anomalies had grown worse, they said, in the last few decades, and they all invariably mentioned the old clock tower. The tower stood at the village crossroads, a squat, square structure of flint and limestone, its face bare of a clock, its interior silent and sealed for 100 years. Local lore held that the last clockmaker, a reclusive genius named Alaric, had been working on a revolutionary mechanism, a device he claimed could measure the weight of a moment. The official story was that he had died, his work unfinished, but the older, darker whispers suggested his experiment had not failed, but had succeeded catastrophically, unleashing the very temporal instability that now plagued the village. The clock tower wasn't just dormant, it was the wound, the epicenter of the temporal quakes. On a day when the air itself seemed to buzz with latent history, Gray approached the tower. The oak door was thick with grime, its iron lock rusted shut. Using a crowbar he'd borrowed from the pub's innkeeper, who had handed it over with a look of grim fatalism, he pried at the aged wood. With a groan of protesting timber and metal, the lock gave way, and the door swung inward on darkness and the smell of dust and old oil. Inside, the tower was a single, cylindrical chamber, dominated by the colossal, intricate skeleton of Alaric's unfinished masterpiece. Gears the size of cartwheels, pendulums of polished brass, and a complex web of wires and crystalline lenses filled the space, all frozen in a silent metallic scream. But it was not entirely dead. At the heart of the mechanism, a complex array of interlocking silver discs and a central, milky crystal pulsed with a faint, sickly light. A low, subaudible hum vibrated through the stone floor, a frequency that set Gray's teeth on edge. This was it. The residual energy from Alaric's experiment, the Chronos engine, not broken but damaged, its regulating mechanism shattered, its power leaking out in uncontrolled waves, bleeding time across the village. He saw the problem immediately. A mainspring, a coil of blued steel thicker than his arm, had snapped. The released energy was being chaotically channeled through the crystal core, warping the local flow of time instead of measuring it. The slips were the symptoms of this catastrophic failure. To stabilize time, he wouldn't have to understand the full, genius complexity of the device. He would have to perform emergency surgery on it. He would have to repair the spring. It took him the rest of the day and into the night, working by the beam of his electric torch. The air in the tower was thick with temporal static. The past pressed in on him, showing him flickering images of Alaric himself, a gaunt, frantic figure making adjustments, his face alight with a terrifying fervor just before the final, disastrous snap. Gray worked with a historian's reverence and a surgeon's focus, using tools he found in a dusty chest. He painstakingly reset the broken spring, using clamps and his own strength to wind it back to a state of tension, mimicking the design he inferred from the other, intact components. It was an act of profound intuition, a guess across a chasm of centuries. As he tightened the final bolt, the pulsing light from the crystal core steadied. The sickly throb became a calm, rhythmic glow. The subaudible hum softened, transforming from a dissonant rattle into a deep, resonant, and harmonious tone, like the lowest note of a massive bell. The oppressive, shifting pressure in the air vanished. The flickering ghosts of the past, which had been a constant, shimmering backdrop in the tower, solidified into one final, clear image. Alaric, his face no longer frantic, but peaceful, his eyes meeting Gray's across the years. He gave a slow, grateful nod, and then faded, not like a ghost, but like a finished thought. Gray stumbled out of the tower. As the first true dawn in what felt like an eternity began to lighten the sky, the village looked the same, but it felt different. The air was clean, the light was steady, and the world felt solid beneath his feet. The time slips had ceased. The river of time had returned to its banks, flowing in one clear, singular direction. He left the village later that morning, the repaired clock tower a secret he would carry with him. He had not just fixed a machine, he had sutured a wound in reality itself. The experience had given him an insight that no amount of book learning ever could. History was not a linear path, but a fluid, living force, and human experience was a fragile vessel upon its surface. The past was not a foreign country. It was the very ground upon which the present was built, and sometimes that ground could shift. He drove away with a new, humbled understanding of the profound and delicate fluidity of it all. The residual energy calmed, the timeline stabilized, and the silent, steady ticking of the cosmos restored. The night in this nameless village did not fall. It pooled, a thick black ink that seeped from the woods and swallowed the last slivers of twilight whole. For Hunter Kate, standing at the edge of the tree line with a high-powered rifle resting cool against her shoulder, the darkness was not an absence, but a presence. It was alive, breathing, and it was watching her back. She had tracked anomalous predators across 3 continents, from snow-blinded tundras to sweltering jungles, but the stories that led her here spoke of a quarry that was less animal and more a moving piece of the night itself. The locals called them shadow beasts, and they spoke of them not with the fear of hunters who have lost livestock, but with the reverent dread of acolytes discussing their temple guardians. Kate shifted her weight, the damp grass muffling the sound. Her thermal scope was useless. It showed only the uniform chill of the night. Her motion sensors had remained silent, yet the feeling of being the watched instead of the watcher was a crawling sensation between her shoulder blades. Then she saw it, not a shape but a deeper darkness detaching itself from the solid black of the forest edge. It was large, easily the size of a bear, but its form was impossible to pin down. It seemed to be made of shifting, oily smoke, its edges fraying and reforming, absorbing the scant starlight rather than reflecting it. It moved with a fluid, silent grace that defied its size, flowing over the ground like spilled ink across parchment. It had no eyes, no muzzle, no discernible features, yet she felt its attention lock onto her with the force of a physical blow, a cold, predatory intelligence that stripped away her camouflage and her confidence, seeing only the warm, living prey beneath. A second shape emerged a dozen yards to the left, then a third. They were amorphous, their sizes fluctuating, sometimes hulking and broad, other times elongating into low, serpentine forms. They made no sound, not even the whisper of displaced air. Their movement was a void in the fabric of the night, a negative space that advanced with a patient, inexorable purpose. Kate's finger tightened on the trigger, but what did one shoot? There was no heart to aim for, no brain to stop. They were manifestations of hunger given form, and she felt the primal, ancient part of her brain scream at her to flee, to hide from the thing that had haunted mankind's dreams since they first huddled around a fire. She held her ground, her breath a pale ghost in the frigid air. The beasts did not charge, they simply surrounded. They flowed into a loose semicircle, cutting off her retreat to the village, their silent vigil more terrifying than any roar. This was not a hunt, it was an assessment. The predatory presence was not merely physical, it was psychic, a pressure that sought out fear and fed on it. She forced her breathing to slow, her mind to quiet, projecting a wall of calm defiance. For a long, suspended moment, the standoff held. Then, as if responding to a silent signal, the shadows seemed to lose interest. They dissolved not by moving away, but by simply unraveling, their substance bleeding back into the greater darkness of the woods until the field was empty once more, leaving only the cold and the pounding of her own heart. Back in the village, the few lights in the cottages were shuttered, the lanes empty. The locals she had interviewed by day had been evasive, their answers wrapped in superstition. They are the old guardians, one grizzled farmer had told her, his eyes avoiding hers. They keep worse things out of the woods. We leave them be and they leave us be. But Kate had seen the look in their eyes, a deep ingrained fear masquerading as respect. She sat in her rented room, cleaning her rifle with methodical precision, the memory of the formless, shifting shapes burned onto her retinas. Guardians or not, they were a biological and phenomenological impossibility. They were a symptom, not the cause. The locals might accept them as part of the village's strange ecology, but Kate was determined to peel back the layers of folklore and fear. She would uncover their origin, trace them back to their source, and in doing so, she would learn what kind of darkness needed such terrible things to stand watch over it. The encounter with the shadow beasts had not been a confrontation, but a revelation. They were not predators in any natural sense. They were sentinels, their formless, shifting nature a perfect camouflage for a purpose that was not of tooth and claw, but of pure distilled intent. The predatory presence Kate had felt was not a hunger for flesh, but a vigilance, a psychic barrier probing for weakness, for the scent of fear that might signal a threat to what they guarded. The villagers' reverent dread was not misplaced. They lived in the shadow of their protectors, a necessary, terrifying symbiosis, driven by this new understanding. Kate spent the next day not in the woods, but among the people. Her approach softened from hunter to historian. She sought out the eldest among them, a woman named Anya whose face was a web of wrinkles and whose eyes held the deep, still knowledge of the land. In the quiet of Anya's cottage, surrounded by the scent of drying herbs and old wood, the true story emerged. It was not a tale of monsters, but of desperation. Generations ago, the village had been plagued by a creeping, psychic malaise, a despair that seeped from the deep woods, twisting thoughts and draining hope. In their terror, the villagers had pooled their collective fear, their fear of the dark, of the unknown, of the things that watched from between the trees. And through an old, half-forgotten ritual, they had given that fear a form. They had forged the shadow beasts from the very substance of their own dread, creating guardians whose sole purpose was to protect the village's heart, a small, smooth obsidian stone known as the heart of the woods, kept in a hidden shrine. The beasts were manifestations of their collective terror, bound to the stone, patrolling the borders to keep the greater, formless despair of the forest at bay. But the stone had been moved, taken by a well-meaning but foolish traveler decades ago for safekeeping. And in its absence, the beasts had grown more restless, their forms more volatile, their vigilance tinged with a frantic, destabilizing energy. The origin of the beasts was now clear. They were not born of the woods, but of the human heart, a desperate prayer for protection made manifest. To calm them, to restore the balance, the stone had to be returned. Anya, her hands trembling with age, revealed where the traveler had hidden it, beneath the floorboards of the abandoned mill at the village's edge. Kate found the stone there, nestled in dust and shadows. It was cool to the touch, its surface impossibly smooth, and holding it sent a strange, calming resonance through her bones. It felt like silence given weight. As dusk began to bleed into night, she carried the heart of the woods back toward the forest, to the simple, moss-covered stone shrine Anya had described, nestled in a clearing at the wood's edge. The shadow beasts were waiting. They coalesced from the twilight as she approached, their amorphous forms swirling around her, the air growing cold and thick with their presence. The predatory pressure returned, but this time it was different. It was focused on the stone in her hands. She felt their silent, collective attention, not as a threat, but as a profound, yearning recognition. They were not surrounding an intruder, they were escorting a lost king home. She walked slowly, deliberately into the clearing. The shrine was a simple arch of weathered stone, its center a hollow that perfectly matched the shape of the obsidian heart. Without hesitation, she stepped forward and placed the stone back into its resting place. The moment it settled into the mossy cradle, a wave of palpable energy washed out from the shrine. The shifting, oily forms of the shadow beasts stilled, their frantic, frayed edges smoothed. The oppressive, chilling presence softened, transforming from a vigilant threat into a deep, watchful calm. They did not vanish, but they settled, their forms becoming less distinct, more like natural patches of deep shadow beneath the ancient trees. The psychic pressure lifted, replaced by a profound and peaceful silence. The guardians, their purpose reaffirmed, their anchor restored, had been calmed. Kate stood for a moment in the clearing, the restored balance a tangible force in the cool night air. She then turned and walked back to the village, the shadow beasts making no move to follow or hinder her. Their work and hers was done. She left at first light, the village stirring behind her, the memory of the formless guardians now a part of her. As she drove away, the rising sun burning the mist from the fields, she pondered the intricate, paradoxical nature of fear and protection. The village had been saved by the very thing it feared most. The shadow beasts were a lesson written in darkness, that sometimes the most powerful shields are forged from our own deepest terrors, and that true protection often requires not the eradication of fear, but its harnessing, its careful, respectful binding to a sacred duty. The beasts were not monsters to be slain, but a mirror held up to the village's soul, a permanent, silent reminder that the line between a guardian and a nightmare is often drawn only by the purity of its purpose.